Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, allow me to inform several guidelines during these sessions. Bapak Ibu, selamat datang di webinar hari ini. And before we start, I will give information about several guidelines during this session. First, you may type your question via the Q&A feature by mentioning your name, institution, and the name of the speaker you are proposing the question to. All of your questions can be submitted in English and Bahasa Indonesia. We also provide the interpreter feature, and please select the language that you need if you need any assisting for the translating. Thank you and hope you enjoy our today's webinar. Don't forget to be active and listen to our speakers.
OJK memiliki visi dan komitmen yang kuat dalam pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan secara berkelanjutan, guna mendukung terwujudnya industri jasa keuangan yang stabil, kontributif, dan inklusif. Kami sadar, dalam mewujudkan visi tersebut, peran SDM yang unggul dan kompeten menjadi kunci utama. OJK Institute hadir untuk menjadi Center of Excellence, guna mendukung pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan dan melakukan riset-riset yang inovatif dan terkini. Pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan yang kompeten dan profesional menjadi salah satu faktor penting dalam mendukung keberhasilan kinerja lembaga jasa keuangan. OJK Institute memiliki 3 fungsi utama. 1. Mengembangkan kapasitas SDM sektor jasa keuangan melalui penyelenggaraan program pelatihan, seminar, dan workshop. 2. Melakukan riset yang inovatif dan visioner. 3. Merancang dan mengembangkan standar kompetensi SDM sektor jasa keuangan, serta melakukan penata laksanaan lembaga sertifikasi profesi. Dalam rangka meningkatkan kompetensi SDM di sektor jasa keuangan, OJK Institute menyelenggarakan berbagai program capacity building, baik dalam bentuk workshop ataupun webinar. Menghadirkan narasumber terbaik yang memiliki keahlian di bidangnya, antara lain bidang perbankan, pasar modal, IKNB, teknologi digital, dan lain-lain. Riset di OJK Institute berbasis akademik dengan memperhatikan perkembangan terkini. Penyusunan riset menghasilkan temuan dan rekomendasi yang mendukung kinerja sektor jasa keuangan. OJK Institute juga menyediakan perpustakaan digital e-library OJK yang mengelola koleksi buku digital, koleksi internal OJK, koleksi buku fisik, dan koleksi e-resources mitra OJK. Selain itu, manfaatkan juga aplikasi eLib OJK untuk membaca e-book melalui smartphone. Minisite OJK Institute tersedia sebagai portal media digital untuk mempermudah publik mengakses berbagai informasi kegiatan OJK Institute terkini. Selain itu, OJK Institute juga membangun knowledge management system sebagai media pembelajaran dan pertukaran knowledge secara digital yang dapat diakses oleh seluruh SDM sektor jasa keuangan. Indonesia saat ini telah menerapkan strategi pengembangan SDM berbasis kompetensi. OJK Institute bekerja sama dengan instansi-instansi terkait dalam menyusun suatu standarisasi kompetensi yang disebut dengan SKKMI, yang kemudian diturunkan menjadi KKMI. SKKMI dan KKMI dimaksud digunakan oleh lembaga sertifikasi profesi atau LSP dalam penyusunan skema sertifikasi, pengajuan rekomendasi, dan pengajuan pendaftaran ke OJK. Selain 3 fungsi utama tersebut, OJK Institute juga berfungsi sebagai license officer, praktek kerja lapangan, visit OJK, penelitian mahasiswa. OJK Institute memfasilitasi program praktek kerja lapangan di lingkungan OJK bagi pelajar dan mahasiswa. OJK Institute juga menerima kunjungan lembaga pendidikan yang ingin memperluas wawasan bidang tugas dan fungsi OJK serta sektor jasa keuangan. Selain itu, OJK Institute senantiasa memfasilitasi mahasiswa dalam hal penyediaan data atau informasi terkait dengan tugas dan fungsi OJK. Dalam rangka mendukung pengembangan SDM sektor jasa keuangan, OJK telah menerbitkan Cetak Biru Pengembangan Sumber Daya Manusia Sektor Jasa Keuangan 2021-2025 pada 25 Mei 2021. Cetak Biru tersebut memiliki visi yaitu mewujudkan SDM sektor jasa keuangan yang profesional, berintegritas, dan berdaya saing global dalam rangka meningkatkan kinerja sektor jasa keuangan. Visi tersebut dijabarkan dalam 4 pilar misi, yaitu 1. Mengembangkan standarisasi kompetensi SDM. 2. Mengembangkan metode peningkatan kompetensi SDM. 3. Mengembangkan infrastruktur pendukung pengembangan SDM. 4. Mengembangkan SDM yang memiliki kompetensi digital. Implementasi Cetak Biru ini kemudian dituangkan ke dalam 21 program kerja yang akan dilakukan dalam kurun waktu 5 tahun dengan melibatkan peran aktif dari industri, akademisi, OJK, dan lembaga lainnya. OJK Institute memiliki komitmen yang kuat untuk melaksanakan Cetak Biru tersebut bersama-sama dengan pengawas, industri, akademisi, dan pemangku kepentingan lainnya. Cetak Biru tersebut diharapkan menjadi kerangka acuan dalam mendukung pengembangan SDM sektor jasa keuangan. OJK Institute, Center of Excellence.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom.
Waalaikumsalam.
Salam budaya, salam kebajikan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. To begin with, please allow me to extend our warmest welcome to our distinguished speakers and guests. First, Deputy Commissioner of OJK Institute, Bapak Imansyah. Good afternoon, Pak Imansyah. Selamat siang. And then, Head of OJK Institute, Bapak Agus Sugiarto. Selamat siang, Pak Agus. Semoga sehat-sehat selalu. All leaders and employees of OJK, our partners and speakers from the London Institute of Banking and Finance, Mr. Thomas Verhagen, Ms. Veronique Chaplin, Mr. Karwi Ang, Ms. Sarah Mabelis, and Ms. Lee Yin Tang. Good afternoon, everyone. Presentation, clarification, assessment team, leaders of Financial Services Industry Association representative, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our webinar. Today we carry the topic of how to manage climate-related risks in banking industry. There are 2,822 people who registered to join this webinar. The majority comes from the banking sector with 64.2%, the non-bank financial industry 16.3%, others 5.7%, academicians 5.4%, OJK 3.83%, government agencies 2.69%, and the capital market sector 1.81%. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, allow me to run a quick brief of our agenda today. Our webinar will be started with opening remarks by Deputy Commissioner of OJK Institute, followed by presentation and panel discussion, and then you can join to our question and answer sessions. And to close with, we will hear the closing remarks from our panelists. To start our event, please allow me to welcome Deputy Commissioner of OJK Institute, Bapak Imansyah, to deliver his welcoming remarks. To Bapak Imansyah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon, uh, ladies and gentlemen. At first, I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers, Mr. Thomas Verhagen, and also Mrs. Veronica Chaplin of the London Institute of Banking and Finance as a speakers, as our today's speakers, as well as Mr. Kawi Ang and Miss Sarah Mabelis, and also Miss Lee Ying Ang, as well as from the London Institute of Banking and Finance. Surely, I would like to regard as well officials and also staff of OJK, association leaders and representatives, officials and employees of the financial sectors in Indonesia, and also all distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let us praise and give thanks for the presence of the God Almighty, because by His grace and gift, we are all able to attend virtually this webinar today with the title "How to Manage Climate-Related Risk in the Banking Industry." To this webinar, it is very good opportunity. I would like to thank to all participants for attending today's webinar. It is organized together by OJK Institute and our colleagues from the London Institute of Banking and Finance. Surely, thank you for all speakers as well, for who have dedicated your time to share your knowledge, insights to all of the participants, and also special gratitude to the participants from the financial sector industries. Ladies and gentlemen, as we may know already, that the climate change that we have recently experienced together has become one of the main problems faced by the majority of people in the world today. Based on the perception survey from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2022, it is mentioned that climate change in the next 10 years is considered a risk that poses the greatest long-term threat to all of us. So the impact of the COVID-19 as well, the pandemic that we experienced for the last at least 2 years, although recently the task force for handling COVID-19 in Indonesia has issued a circular letter which allow all domestic and foreign travelers, public facilities, and large-scale activities not to wear masks anymore. But this has resulted in a domino effect on various aspects, for one of which is climate change. And this is supported by data released by Ernst & Young based on the 11 annual EYIF Global Bank Risk Management Survey, that 90% of the chief risk officers agree that climate is the most important risk today. According to these situations, it is very much relevant that typically bank has put this climate-related risk into two kind of risks. First, it is called namely physical risk, includes risks that have an impact on the premises and operations of banks, customers, and the economy on a wider scale. Long-term extreme weather and climate change events that lead to the closure of branches of retail facilities that would negatively impact clients' creditworthiness and adversely affect asset prices are some examples of physical risk. And the second type of risk is transition risk, which includes risks that impact bank products and services, as a result of the transitions to a lower carbon economy. The extent to which banks fund and own shares in companies that emit greenhouse gases or GHGs, changes in stakeholder expectations, and changes in related laws and all regulation are all examples of transition risk. In this regard, I think my view is also that sometimes also related to how much that we can allocate it budget for doing transitions from the conventional business model of our banks to the business model that very much honoring the issue of how we are mitigating the climate change. Further, there are at least three main challenges faced by the banking industry in dealing with climate related risks. First, risk assessment of companies transitioning to a zero carbon economy. As it is known that the transition to a zero carbon economy certainly require cost that, as I mentioned just now, and where this cost will later affect the increase of financing needs that will be submitted to banks from a company. Second, lack of frameworks and standards regarding climate change risk, so that bank has to move with different methodologies to assess climate change risk in the short term. To my view as well and to my knowledge, I think when we are drafting regulations with regard to the management, the risk management, and how we are adopting standard from the international standard setter like Basel Committee. So we have these kind of standards, but in the area of climate change, or then we have to look further for other international standards and come up with like a standard regulations that we can adopt, tailoring our domestic situations and conditions that fit to our financial institution as well. And the third, for sure, this is a very common issue, is lack of experts in this field. Even climate change is the most important and needed risk management skills in the future after cyber and cyber security and data science. Well, I think so when we have this lack of experts in this particular area, then we don't have any um, uh, uh, factors that or aspect that support us that we can come up like a very good and comprehensive regulations that will assist us on how we are going forward to mitigate the climate change that happened today. Participants, ladies and gentlemen, various efforts have been made at the global level to mitigate the risk of climate change, including by reducing the GHGs emissions from human activities. One of the policies adopted in the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming between 1.0 to 2 degrees Celsius. And in this regard, the Indonesian government also plays an active role in supporting the effort to reduce the global emissions by targeting achieving net zero emissions in 2060 or even sooner. And further, Indonesia is committed as well to reduce the GHGs by 41% with international assistance, or 29% with business as usual, as conveyed through the National Determined Contributions or NDCs document. Webinar participants in this area, it is start several years ago as well that OJK actively participated already in how we are going forward addressing the issue of this climate change, and also with the collaborations with government entities that committed to exercise the Paris Agreement through efforts to develop sustainable finance, as stated in the sustainable finance roadmap phase that in 2015 2019, and the second one that has been issued in 2021 and will be available up to 2025. For information, the implementation of the first phase of the sustainable finance roadmap OJK has issued some regulations that related to the how we're going forward to being uh, uh, addressing in a very good way how we are how we are regulating this sustainable finance. So I think in this regard, I think we also now going forward, we are also in our pipeline, we are going to issue as well regulation with regard to the carbon. Then I think that very much that one is very also relevant how we are addressing the issue of this climate change. So all in all, I think we are doing a lot of efforts to being very much concerned with the climate change, and also how we are facilitating the financial sectors to also become aware with climate change, and also with the type of risk that they are facing, as I mentioned before, with the transition risk and also with the physical risk because of this adopting of these our policies for the climate change. So this is the webinar that we'll be addressing as well. I think the policies, the insights, the experience from the expert, and how we are going forward to set up our environment, our ecosystem that will support us in a better way going forward to have our sustainable finance framework, and it is doable, and it is also acceptable, and at the end it is very much relevant with the government initiative to reduce the carbon emissions in due time. So ladies and gentlemen, I wish that through this webinar today can gain a lot of insight, knowledge, and also experience from the expert, from the speakers, how we are, frame our, set up our climate change, and also how we are manage the climate-related risk in a formal way or in other way that very much supporting our approach at the end. Then we are very much also concerned with climate change that happened today. So I wish you a very good discussions through this webinar. And I think again, I have to, on behalf of OJK, my gratitude extended to all speakers, Mr. Thomas Verhagen, Mrs. Veronica Chaplin, Pak Aldi Hawari as a moderator, and also Mr. Ka Wi Ang and Mrs. Sarah Mabelis, Ms. Lee Ying Tan, and also Pak Agus Sugiyato from the OJK Institute, and other colleagues within OJK Institute, and surely all the participants of the webinar today. I stop here my remarks, and thank you for your attentions, and wish you having a very good discussion today. Thank you so much. I say thank you again for the OJK Institute and also the London Institute of Banking Finance. Thank you, and good afternoon from Jakarta. Thank you, and I end my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bapak. All right. Thank you very much, Bapak Imansyah, for such a warm welcome and also your key points highlights to our event. If I may conclude the addressing remarks from Bapak Imansyah. Climate change has become a major problem according to World Economic Forum and is considered as the greatest long-term risk. Further, post-COVID-19 situation is giving various effects on climate change. Bank has put climate risk as a priority. Therefore, climate risk can impact bank product and also services, such as changes in bonds and also loans. There are at least three main challenges to bank industry regarding on the climate change and climate risk. First, lack of risk assessment to transition to zero emission. Second, lack of standard regarding climate change risk to tailored with regional condition. And the third is lack of expert to mitigate the climate change and how to mitigate it on the banking sector. We will address this issue more on our presentation and also panel discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, before any further ado, we will start our first presentations. But I will give some information before we start the presentation from our first speaker. It is you may type your questions on Q&A feature that on your Zoom webinar meeting. You may put your name followed by institutions and the name of the speaker you are proposing your questions to. All your questions can be submitted in English or Bahasa. And at the end of the session, we will also share a feedback form on the chat feature. So please complete the feedback form, the latest by Friday, June 16th, as a requirement to get your webinar certificate. So without any further delay, let's start with our first speaker, Mr. Thomas Verhagen from LIBF, who will be sharing his insights with us on understanding the nature of climate risk and how to mitigate it. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Thomas Verhagen. But first, allow me to present to you his resume or CV. Mr. Thomas Verhagen is a former banker specialized in sustainable finance and with experience ranking client coverage, risk management, financial restructuring, and product innovation across the Americas and EMEA. Thomas has worked with bank, asset managers, pension funds, BFIs, social enterprises, financial regulators, fintechs, and universities. His drives come from a desire to help grow businesses and institutions that successfully combine commerciality and sustainability at scale. Having previously led the banking group at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, or CISL, he now holds a senior associateship there with a special focus on fintech for sustainability. Thomas is the co-author of the CFA's ESG investing certification. All right, after this presentation, Mr. Thomas Verhagen will also join in the group panelists and conduct panel discussions along with Ms. Veronique Chaplin. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Thomas Verhagen. Hello, Mr. Thomas. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And hello, good afternoon, everybody. In Indonesia, Assalamualaikum, Selamat Siang. I thought I practiced a little bit before saying hello to you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you. As it's my third time that I do a seminar or presentation for the OJK, I see that the numbers of participants have been growing from time to time. First time was, I remember with Pak Edi Setijawan in the offices in Jakarta itself with a group of OJK specialists. Second time was 2 years ago with a webinar such as this. I think we had 1,600 people, and now we have no less than more than 2,800 people. So you can see that the topic of climate change sustainability has been growing over that time, and then you can expect it to grow more in the near future. So Very happy that you are here. I think it's a great choice to be here today and to look into this important topic. So I'm going to share my screen, and in the next 75 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through how to manage climate-related risks in the banking sector. And my lens here is going to be to connect that management of climate-related risks to the management of broader sustainability or ESG risks. I will explain all of that during the presentation, and we will look into not only the role of formal risk management, but also the role of the so-called first line of defense, those clients at the banks, the banking institutions that face clients. So those colleagues that face clients. Now, let's get it started. And I have been introduced already, so we're not going to dive into that. That's me then with a beard and a mustache. I shaved that off since. And yeah, otherwise, I hope you recognize the person that's speaking to you today. So what's going to be the agenda? What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about ESG and climate risks. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance, and why they matter to banks. Why is this an important thing? And we had this wonderful introduction earlier on by Baba Imansia, and he already indicated the importance that is being recognized of this topic. Now, the second thing we're going to look at is how ESG and climate are financially material, and we're going to explain what financial materiality actually means. And then thirdly, we're going to look at how relationship managers can sell green products that help mitigate risk for both the client and the bank. And so there's a clear role, not just for the risk managers here, but also for those colleagues that sit and in the front office. I think many of you will have heard of how environmental risks and social risk and governance risk can be financial material to a company or a company. We will share some case studies on that as well. So that's what you can expect today. We're going to start with a quick recap for those of you that might be unfamiliar with the term ESG. It has been in the news internationally a lot in the recent years, but we want to recap just to make sure that everybody gets to the same level of understanding. When we talk about ESG, we are talking about environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors. Now, environmental factors are those factors such as climate change, biodiversity, and deforestation. Deforestation also causes greenhouse gas emissions, very large emissions of carbon, CO2 through deforestation, but also the depletion of resources and waste and pollution. You might have heard about plastic pollution that is endemic, and particles, microparticles of plastics being found in human organs and disrupting human hormone cycles, because these plastics molecularly look similar to these hormones. Now that's an example of waste and pollution, and it falls under environmental factors. Social factors is to do with health and safety, labor standards, human rights and community, and customer responsibility. And we're going to focus a little bit less on that during this particular webinar, but typically, if you look at it from a bank stakeholder perspective, environmental factors and social factors and government factors are looked at in conjunction and in combination. And then governance factors has to do with the structure of the companies that banks finance and that investors invest in, so investee companies. It's less to do with the private persons and families and households that are being financed through retail banking, but it's a very relevant lens to look at if you are in commercial banking or in investment banking, and you have to work on a day-to-day basis with the world of business. The type of topics that governance factors look at have to do with board independence and the diversity of boards. So is there not just diversity of backgrounds, but also a diversity of thinking and different perspectives to look at the business of the company. It looks at remuneration and incentives. What are people paid to do? What are people stimulated to do, choices to make? It looks at things like tax fairness, corruption, and it looks at reporting and transparency. Now, increasingly, all of these three types of factors, and with factors we mean both a phenomena, so a thing that can happen, like for example, the loss of forest. I'm going to use my laser pointer here, and that's a phenomenon. That's a factor, but also the measurement of the phenomena. And so often factors are integrated as metrics as well, or statistics. Now, these factors, both environmental, social, and governance, increasingly influence each other. If you have a community that is not wealthy, maybe that's poor, then that's a social factor. Maybe labor issues come into play, or they've historically been disadvantaged. Then it might be more challenging for that community to balance environmental factors, to not deforest, for example, or to not deplete the resources that a community avails of. Now, in the past, the analysis of risk from sustainability and ESG was very much separated. We looked at environmental factors, social factors, governance factors. Increasingly, we can see that there's an interdependence between social factors, between proper governance, and between environmental factors. And for climate change, we see that all the more. The type of governance, the type of social needs, for example, for goods or for power, electricity, development, sometimes seem to be at odds or provide some tension with environmental objectives that we need to meet in order to counter the climate crisis. So why do we bother about these topics? Why do we bother about ESG factors? Why do we bother with climate and with climate risk? Now, we bother with that. Some people bother with that because they feel the intrinsic value of caring and being involved. But from a financial sector perspective, from a regulatory and supervisory perspective, and from a risk management perspective, we need to look at materiality. Now, what is materiality? Materiality is the issues that are important for a company or a business sector. It was first formulated in the United States in the 1930s in a law that had to do with disclosure of information to investors. And materiality then in that law was defined as any information that would lead to changes or influences the decisions of the owners of a company. It's a subjective exercise. So there's no one golden rule to determine what is material to a company, what is material to a sector, or what is material to a country. And so you will see differences there between companies, sectors, and countries across the globe. And no formal monetary threshold has been set globally to determine what financial impacts should be deemed material. But in practice, often some practitioners say that in financial reporting, they keep a threshold of 5% of net income for example, reporting on a profit and loss account, and that will be considered material. Yeah, so you can see it has a background in accounting, focused on the uses of company information, but increasingly it's being used internally in the company as well for risk management purposes and decision-making purposes. Now, here we go. Accounting is always about the importance of a matter, and it's subjective. Now, we see that materiality is being used in two different contexts. First off, in financial reporting, as I indicated, it stems from legislation from the US that was focused on accounting, financial reporting from the 1930s. Increasingly, it's being used also to report on the impact, the sustainability impacts of an activity, of a project, or of a firm. And then we start to look at these three factors that we just saw: environmental factors, social factors, less so governance factors, but mostly environmental and social factors. So what is that type of materiality? Now, it became a little bit confusing to have these two types of ways of using materiality, financial and sustainability. So what you see is that we started to distinguish between two things: financial materiality and impact materiality. And so financial materiality has to do with the influencing the decisions of the users of a company's financial information. The expectation is that that is included in the financial reporting of the firm. So they will influence enterprise value. Anything that's financially material influences enterprise value. You can read more on that if you're interested on the website of the International Accounting Standards Board. So that's financial materiality. Now, impact materiality works in the other direction as well. So where we saw that financial materiality is to do with anything that comes from outside of the company, having an effect internally into the finances of the company, impact materiality works the other way around. So that's any activity that a company deploys and that has an impact, a sustainability impact on its surroundings. So on the natural environment, on society, on specific institutions, and anything like that. So it has to do with people, environment, and the economy. Now, the next step, of course, is to combine these two things, and that's the so-called double materiality. And double materiality is a topic that has been growing over the course of the last few years, because increasingly there's an understanding that the impacts that a company has on its surroundings can circle back to that company as well, by means of litigation, by means of increased risks of all types across risk taxonomy. So in double materiality, the term works in two directions: financial implications for the firms and sustainability impact for the surroundings of the firm. So it's a new concept. It's defined by the European Union, or at least it's been adopted by the European Union a couple of years ago. And it refers to those issues that can have a significant repercussions on the company, both positive and negative, and the issues that the company has a significant influence on to its choice of actions. So it's an extension of that key accounting term called financial materiality, and it's embedded in EU law. And EU law has a tendency to influence businesses outside of the EU. That happens to any big economic bloc, so-called extra-jurisdictional effect. So companies and organizations and countries outside of these big economic blocs, including the EU or maybe the US, will likely encounter double materiality as well. Now, an example of mainly financial materiality and regulators diving into financial materiality, but potentially also some impact materiality, double materiality actually, is the way in which the Basel Committee, which is the overarching committee of central banks across the globe. So you have the Bank for International Settlements, that's the central bank of central banks, as they call it, and affiliated is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which is a collaborative group of central banks that coordinate and think and give guidelines on how banks should be supervised. Now, they published the principles for effective management and supervision of climate-related financial risks. And last year, it was June 2022. It's 1 year old now. And what Basel said was that banks are potentially exposed to climate-related financial risks, regardless of their size, complexity, or business model. What they mean is that banks are exposed not only to financial risks, but financial materiality, but to double materiality. Their clients can have all kinds of impacts that can flow through risk transmission channels, but also banks themselves, through their financing, can increase the risks that are being imposed on society and on nature and the environment. The BIS, or the Basel Committee, recognized that climate-related financial risk drivers can translate into traditional financial risk categories, and so-called transmission of risk. And therefore, it said that banks should consider the potential impacts of climate-related risk drivers on their business models and assess the financial materiality of these risks. So what you have here is that the Central Bank of Central Banks issues a statement, which is quite formal, stating that banks are exposed to these climate risks and that they should take action at the strategic level. So in their business models and in the evaluation of the financial materiality of these risks. And what that leads to is that banks need to start to look at their risk appetite. So when we talk about the management of climate risk with banks, it starts centrally with risk management and with the board, maybe even of a bank, thinking through what the appetite of that bank is with respect to this particular category of risk. So you can see that this clearly sits within the domain of the chief risk officer of a bank. And the BIS, the Basel Committee, stated that banks should manage climate-related financial risk in a manner that is proportionate to the nature, scale, and complexity of their activities and the overall level of risk that each bank is willing to accept. So you see immediately that points to that risk appetite role. It needs to be similar to credit risk and to market risk and to operational risk. And what is being increasingly recognized by supervisors and by people like my colleagues at Cambridge, has been recognized for the past 6, 7, maybe 10 years, is that the risks from climate change that were mentioned earlier, transition risk and physical risk, can translate into other types of risk. So it's not about reputation alone, doing the nice things and being perceived as the good bank. Increasingly, you're going to see that the risks that stem from climate, either to transition or to physical risk, are going to translate into credit risk and operating risk. Market risk potentially, maybe to a lesser extent, liquidity risk. And these are some of the very classical risk categories that have been managed by risk management within banks for years, for decades. So what does Basel state more? They indicated that the climate risk need to be the responsibility of the senior management of the bank. That needs to sit at the top, and then from there it needs to trickle all the way down. So it can't be allocated to a sustainability department anymore, or a chief sustainability officer, a sustainability manager, or sustainability reporting team. That used to be the case in the past for many banks, but Basel indicated that that's not acceptable anymore. The consequence of that is that the approach to climate risk, whether that's acceptance, whether that's mitigation, whether that's the transfer of risk, maybe to insurance, maybe a bit more on that later, or whether that's the avoidance, needs to be integrated in the business strategy across all time horizons. Because the interesting thing with climate and climate risk is that the time horizons tend to be a bit different from your classical credit risk, which runs for anywhere from a day to 4 or 5 years. If you hold mortgages to maturity, maybe 30 years. It needs to be integrated across all time horizons. It also needs to be integrated in the risk frameworks, in the policies and the processes of the bank. Yeah, so the risk frameworks needs to have a category of climate risk. The transition risks that we've been talking about. So any changes, legal changes that might happen, technological changes that might happen, changes in consumer preference that might happen, obsolescence of assets that don't have a value anymore. So then the value of your collateral goes down. All of that needs to have a place within the risk framework, and that's only transition risk. Physical risk, likewise, needs to be integrated in the risk frameworks as well. And that might be anything from extreme droughts to floodings, to rising sea levels. Yeah? The policy and the processes that are built on top of these risk frameworks need to integrate climate risk as well. Now, obviously, that means that you need to be able to steer and to know what you're doing. You can't drive a car if you don't have a steer. You can say that you want to go someplace, or you want to say that you want to move forward in a certain way, but if you don't have the information, you don't have the agency, you don't have the data, and you don't have the IT architecture that generates the data and that processes that data, you won't have a steer and you won't be able to go where you want to go. So that means that climate risk needs to be integrated in the IT architecture and into the data architecture of a bank as well. Now, and then the final task that Basel identified is that the 3 LOD, the 3 lines of defense, being the client-facing clients, risk management, and audit, that they are being tasked with identifying climate risks, measuring climate risks, and feeding that into the data flows, into the IT architecture, and then mitigating these climate risks. Now, this was a very bold publication by Basel, and it will very likely, I think, reverberate. So it will create a wave through the world of central bank and supervisors in the coming period, and through that, of course, it will have an effect on banks and bankers such as yourself. Now, we saw that the 3 lines of defense are tasked to identify, measure, and mitigate climate risks. And so what do we mean by that? Now, identification means that the banks should identify, monitor, and manage all climate-related financial risks, right? So identification entails material risk in dollar terms or in monetary terms. It means that banks need to provide capital for unexpected losses. So it goes directly to the capital framework of the bank. It means that banks likely, if they identify that there might be expected losses, that they likely need to integrate that in the credit spread they charge to the client. So you need to charge the client for that. It also means that you need to, the banks need to adjust their liquidity reserve if needed. That's what it can mean. Then, in terms of monitoring, banks and clients need to aggregate and get a granular understanding on these climate financial risks. and they need to report changes against a consistent standard. Now, it's to be expected that in terms of methodology, there will be a bit of a mixed approach. I remember working at a risk management department, policy and modeling for the implementation of Basel II. That was at the bank, and what we noticed was that the central bank asked all participants in the market for their approaches, for their methodology, then compared these methodologies and identified the good practices, which they then shared with the wider industry. And in that way, gradually, step by step, an approach and a methodology emerged that was taken across all the banks in that market. Something like that is likely to be expected in this space, in the climate risk space as well. And then finally, banks are expected to manage these climate-related financial risks. So set limits and define materiality thresholds for the risks you want to take and you don't want to take. And that can be across regions, it can be across sectors, it can be across products as well. So any way you can think of within the cross-section of a bank, if you want to slice it up, slice and dice, you can set these limits and define materiality thresholds, depending on what you find is material for your bank, for your clients, for the business model of your bank. You would be expected to adjust your credit underwriting as well. I'm going to look at the role of client-facing colleagues in a moment. And that brings us to an engagement with the clients, both at the moment of onboarding and the Know Your Client process, as well as in the underwriting process for lending and for the sales of products. An engagement would need to take place to understand what the climate risks are that client is exposed to, and then would expose the bank to. And then finally, Basel indicated that there would likely to be a restraint on new exposures to manage a runoff of certain climate risks. And this can have important consequences for clients in highly exposed sectors. For example, in some countries there will be coal. The coal is a fossil fuel. Not having access to credit can increase the credit risk of a company as well, of a counterpart. And so these things need to be taken into account. So if climate financial risk is relevant to a bank, so both in terms of market risk, liquidity risk, and operating risk, then the bank needs to implement these measures. And so that it needs to measure, monitor, and manage. The type of risk can be slightly different across these risk categories, climate risk. So in terms of market risk, there can be a mark-to-market risk of financial instruments that lose their value if there is to be a disorderly situation in the market. And one of the things that we are thinking about, that regulators are thinking about, people in academia are thinking about, some of the best specialists within the banks are thinking about, is that the markets might not go through a so-called orderly transition to a low-carbon economy, an economy that's more aligned with climate objectives. It might be a disorderly transition as well. All of a sudden, there's a policy measure. All of a sudden, there's a tipping point in the natural environment. The weather events become more extreme. Harvests fail. There's a whole load of scenarios that these risk managers are thinking about. And I think this points to an important point about climate risks as well. Many of these risks are forward-looking. This earlier speaker indicated that there's a need for methodology. In many years also people said there's a need for data. But the point is that once the data on climate change and climate risk is in, it is too late. Climate scientists is very clear. Climate risks are a one-way door. We can open the door once, walk through it, but then we can't go back for the foreseeable future, not in a meaningful way, thinking about the time horizons of the financial sector, of an economy, or a human life. The carbon that we emit today by burning forests, by burning peat, by burning coal and fossil fuels, is going to be with us in the atmosphere for the next 30 years. And so anything we do today, like the electricity I use now to be able to use my computer to talk to you, that emits carbon. This carbon is going to be with us 30 years from now when I am 75. And that's what we're talking about. So you need to have some forward-looking approaches as well. Now, that about what ESG and climate risks is and why it matters to banks. Now we're going to dive a little bit more into how ESG and climate are financially material. So there we go. And we're going to look at how ESG risks, particularly climate, can affect financial performance. I already mentioned that this is a forward-looking exercise. There is not that much data, historical data, to base the modeling on. This is different from credit risk. Credit risk, you build up the data over many, many years, over decades. You do your statistical analysis, then you calculate your probabilities, probability of default, probability, the loss given default, you integrate your collateral for your loss given default calculation, etc. But a lot of the data that you would have for traditional financial risk management is not there yet because the physical changes have not happened of Earth, of the landscapes, of the countries that we're all in, for example, Indonesia, not to the extent that is expected by climate scientists. So why is ESG financially material? Why is climate financially material? It's financially material because it poses risks. It poses risks, more on that in a moment. We have some examples. It also poses opportunities to banks and to banks' clients. And there's opportunities to open new markets, to offer new products. There's opportunities to save costs by being more resource efficient. On the risk side, there can be risks from new regulation, which either can be implemented gradually or abruptly. And this is the difference between an orderly transition and a disorderly transition, or one component. There can be adverse changes, negative changes in consumer behavior. All of a sudden, consumers, either the clients of a bank or the clients of a business, decide that they don't like that company, that provider anymore, because the offerings that they offer are not what they need, or because they don't like the behavior of a bank or a company. And this has very much to do with the reputation as well. And of course, then there are the physical impacts. Physical impacts to a bank will mainly feed into the operational risk frameworks that are already in place. But we see that the physical changes and extreme weather events have been increasing over years. Now, an example of physical impact can be, for example, the risks that certain mortgages hold. I don't know whether you saw the news of the last week, but some of the biggest insurance companies of the United States of America have decided not to provide insurance coverage anymore for commercial and for residential real estate in California. So that has a direct implication for the cost of insurance. And the reason that they decided that they won't offer that insurance coverage anymore is that the damages have become so high that in order to cover those damages, they would need to ask prices that they know that they won't be able to negotiate in the market. Now, you see that physical impact immediately has an impact on the business model of these insurance companies. But if you think one step further, in a market like the US, insurance is an important enabler and underpinning service for financing as well. And not only for commercial and real estate, commercial and residential real estate, but for example, also for trade finance and many other forms of finance. Now, what happens if insurance becomes unaffordable? What will be the impact on the business model and the financial model and the viability of products and of clients? You can see that the physical impact trickles down all the way into traditional credit risks. Now, what does that mean? There's risks, there's opportunities. That means that you need to take these risks and opportunities into account. And if they change, if risks change, opportunities change, you have to change your strategic planning. You have to change your risk management. Maybe not overnight, but at some point you need to do it. Otherwise, you don't adapt to changing circumstances. And we know from evolution theory, thank you, Charles Darwin, that if you don't adapt to changing circumstances, an organism goes out of the food chain, it becomes extinct. Now, you don't want that to happen to your clients, and you don't want to happen to your bank. So the financial impacts can flow through the income statement of a client or a bank, to its cash flow statement, or to the balance sheet. It can have an impact on its assets and liabilities. Value of assets and liabilities can go up, can go down as well. That's the balance sheet. Can also have an influence on the capital expenditures. So investment maybe in precautions to shield a company against climate risk, or an investment in a new plant which can take advantage of an opportunity that climate risk or a changing climate entails. Similar on the income statement, the revenues of a company can go up, or the revenues can go down. For these insurance companies, the revenues in California will go down. Likewise with the expenditures. Now, this is about the balance sheet and looking at how these risks and opportunities through the income statement to the balance sheet can lead to impacts on cash flow statement. And cash flow together with collateral, of course, is an important determinant of the financial viability and therefore financial risk of a firm. Now, if we look at valuation, it's a little bit of a sidebar, but increasingly this becomes relevant as well. You see that these cash flows are being discounted. For valuation, investment bankers, they look at the expected cash flows over time, and then they discount them against what the opportunity cost might be in terms of a discount rate. You see that ESG issues and climate issues increasingly are being integrated in valuations as well. That's something you see in London, and that's something that we will expect increasingly across the world as well. Now, we talked about some of the transmissions earlier on, and this is looking at how some of the ESG risks and climate risk can feed into pillar one of a bank's capital. Now, you can see that transmission channels, for example, can go to lower profitability or lower asset performance, a lower real estate value in some instances. If you have a default and real estate goes into foreclosure, and that feeds into financial risks. So it can feed into credit risk, can feed into market risk, into operational risk, concentration risk in some instances, strategic and reputational risk as well. Now, you can calculate or estimate what the expected loss of that would be. Traditionally, that would feed into P&L and into pillar one. Now, ESG risks or climate risks, to a certain extent, are unexpected losses, or can be unexpected losses. You try to get sighted on as much risk as you can, but you don't know when this massive new regulation is coming into place. You don't know when there will be a flood. You can calculate whether a factory is built in a floodplain. There have been massive floods in central Thailand, leading to very big impacts on hard drive factories, and that had a direct influence on Apple, for example. And you can calculate that, you can see that, but to a certain extent, it's going to be unexpected. So you have to account for these unexpected losses as well. I have to estimate that and keep that as a buffer. Depending on what your business risk is, this pillar one risk will need to increase by a little or by a lot. Now, we're going to look at some cases on how climate can impact revenue. This is a case of Volkswagen. This is a German car manufacturer you might know, and they were exposed for installing emission defeat devices on 11 million of their cars. And that's for the car models between 2009 and 2015. So VW, Volkswagen, put emission controls into place. Basically, they were cheating the emission tests of their cars. These control devices were only active during laboratory testing, with the real emissions of CO2 and especially NOx, so nitrogen compounds, sometimes being 40 times higher than the cheating software indicated. Now, when this came out, the sales in the US fell by almost 25% year on year. The stock price of VW fell by 40%, so it was a massive outflow or sell-off of Volkswagen, and there was a big damage to the brand and to the sales. Volkswagen was prosecuted in the US, and there were both corporate law prosecutions, but also criminal law prosecutions, including towards the former CEO. The CEO had to resign. In the end, Volkswagen received a massive fine. It was billions and billions of dollars of fine that was imposed on them. I immediately see that this ESG, this emission, this is a sustainability thing. In the past, we would have thought, yeah, this is not going to impact revenue, or this is not going to have a financial impact. But you immediately see that was the case, and both in terms of actual sales, so revenue going down, in terms of the fine, having to pay out the massive fine, and in terms of the valuation of the stock, and therefore, to a certain extent, the performance of the stock to its investors. Three ways in which there was a direct financial impact from this, sustainability scandal. Now, it's not only through scandals or to fraudulent behavior that climate and ESG can have a financial impact. You can also look at the cost side of things. So, for example, the mining of minerals used in electronics, such as coltan and chromium, that often happens in places where there is limited protection. Limited protection of the environment and limited protection of labor as well. Here you see some children working in a muddy well. This is up to 30 meters deep, and they're extracting ore-laden soil, and they're breathing through a thin rubber tube attached to a compressor. You can't see that in this image, but that's what they do. So often these workers are exposed to mercury poisoning to extraction process, and the majority of this type of labor is limited to artisanal small-scale mining. So it's not Glencore, it's not the very, very, very big companies. Glencore is a very big mining company that has this direct exposure. Typically, it's the smaller mines that have these types of practices. And so many rare earth metals, for example, cobalt, are used in the batteries and other electronic equipments that we are using now to look at each other, or like the phones that we use on a regular basis. What you see is that companies are starting to be rated based on the action they take to avoid these types of situations. And this is not banks, but these are electronics technology companies. And the source is Time magazine. And you can see that companies like Apple and Samsung SDI, they take adequate action to look into their supply chains for these types of risks. But some others, like Microsoft or Lenovo or Huawei, have taken no action at all. And this is from a report by Amnesty International. Now, the risk from consumer action, from regulatory action, from maybe a change in technology of using these types of supply chains, that's a transition risk, and it can translate into other forms of risk and financial risks. And so this is a thing that we need to take into account. ESG can impact operating expenses as well. This is Colorado River. The reservoirs in the Colorado River are at a historical low level. These reservoirs feed into hydropower, they feed into agriculture. The Biden administration calls for a cut in the water use by 25%. There is an expectation that the water utilities will need to increase their operating costs because they need to counter the loss and the evaporation of water. They need to store more water. That means that there will probably be operating expenses or capital expenses for these water utilities. And of course, for the agricultural companies, this is a very desert-like region of the United States. They've been drawing a lot of water here. That's the only reason that there can be agriculture. If there's no water anymore, or the price of water goes up, that will have a direct financial impact on all of the agricultural companies in that region. And then there is financial materiality through legal risk. This is Shell oil company, which has found itself in court in the Netherlands. There was a lawsuit by a group of citizens that indicated that Shell is breaching human rights by expanding its extraction of fossil fuels. And the judge found that in their interpretation of the law, the plaintiffs were right and ruled that Shell is to decrease its extraction, decrease its carbon emissions, and speed up its energy transition. Now, Shell appealed, but if in a higher appeal the original ruling is upheld, then Shell needs to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2019 levels. And also Shell will be held responsible for the emissions not only of its production, but also the emissions of all the cars and all the clients that use its products. And Shell would remove the equivalent of 740 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, which is more than emissions of the country of Germany. So let's keep an eye on that. But this is a massive liability risk feeding directly into the strategic planning, into the capital expenditures, as well as into the revenue of this company. Then we have the financial materiality of deciding whether or not to finance certain carbon-intensive sectors. For example, coal. A couple of years ago, you will have seen, I think 2018, that some major banks indicated that we stop financing new coal plants and new coal mines. HSBC, Bank of China was looking at that as well. That means that the provision of credit goes down, which also might lead to a runoff and to a stampede to the last bank standing. We've seen that with real estate financing during the big crisis in the Atlantic countries in 2008. If you didn't close your door for real estate finance, all the bad real estate finance would come to your bank. This was what I was managing at that time. You can have something similar with a carbon-intensive sector, carbon-intensive companies and clients that are not aligned with a low-carbon economy. Now, most of the coal financing now comes from China. And now I want to move to the final part of my presentation. So we looked at, why does ESG and climate risk, why do they matter to banks? What are the expectations of banks coming out of Basel and expected to be increasingly coming out of national regulators? How are ESG and climate, how are they financially material? What impact do they have on companies, the clients of the banks? What impact do they have on the banks themselves? We mentioned that there's a role for all levels within a bank, from the board level, where there needs to be a clear ownership of who owns climate risks, to the setting of a risk appetite, risk framework, policies and processes, to the IT architecture and the data architecture that supports the decision making, support the steering of the bank, and then to finally to the 3 lines of defense. So not only audit, not only risk management and compliance, but also the client-facing colleagues of the banks, and that's where we are now with this final part of the presentation. How can relationship managers sell green products that help mitigate risk for the client and for the bank? Now, first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about mitigation? Mitigation is something that and net zero means that you gradually phase out the greenhouse gas emissions from your operations and also from your financing portfolio, from your lending portfolio. Net zero is a term that emerged after the Paris Agreement. And net zero means net zero carbon. It means that the carbon emissions go down, as I just indicated. The way that the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, that's a group of very big financial companies, both asset managers, banks, insurance companies, the G funds, the way that they identify that you can move towards net zero financing strategies is by offering climate solutions, by financing entities that are already aligned to the climate pathways, the climate strategy as defined in the Paris Agreement. As we indicated, that's a maximum of 1.5 degrees average climate temperature rise compared to pre-industrial times. By aligning entities that are committed to a 1.5 degrees pathway already, and by a managed phase out of those assets and maybe also clients that are unable to align with 1.5 degrees. So here you can see that the financing of a net zero transition is not only a matter of saying no to clients, it's also a matter of identifying opportunities. And according to McKinsey, these opportunities are really very large. These are global figures. The transition to net zero brings these opportunities across different sectors. You can see the sectors here: carbon management, waste, oil, gas, transportation. And McKinsey indicated that reaching net zero by 2050 could entail a 60% increase in capital spending on physical assets. So you can expect a huge investment boom globally, and that's compared with current levels. And the required investments would amount to $9.2 trillion per year until 2050, of which $6.5 trillion annually would go into low emission assets and enabling infrastructure. But these are massive capital investments that we're talking about. And of course, part of that will be financed through to IPOs and equity. Part of that big chunk will be financed through bond issues and to tradable debt in the markets. But also a big chunk of that will be financed through the lending book of banks. So the opportunity here for banks is to identify the companies and the technologies that will drive these green transitions and do that in time, right? Not too early, certainly not too late. And that starts with risk management, looking at the companies, technologies, the sectors that you know won't be driving the green transition, the net zero transition. And these companies, both those that won't drive the transition as well as those that will drive the transition, can be incumbents, they can be disruptors, they can sit anywhere. So there's an important role for the banking colleagues that already sit in the market, already engage with clients, to identify where these opportunities and where these risks are. So now some examples could be, smart materials. It could be landscape-based finance, nature-based solutions, a very promising approach to cover both biodiversity risk and climate risk. It could be electrification of anything which currently runs on a combustion engine. There's many examples out there, and you can see that I mentioned electrification. That the transportation sector is deemed to be one of the biggest opportunities, alongside the built environment and the power sector by McKinsey. So this is a case study of the expected growth of electrical vehicles. Now, there's a lot of discussion around hydrogen vehicles, electrical vehicles, maybe some other solutions as well in the market. What I see is that likely there will be a mix of different technologies. So there will be some hydrogen companies, there will be some electrical vehicles as well. That's the latest that I heard. So a portfolio approach towards the funding of these technologies might be merited. The majority of new financing of electrical vehicles is originated by banks. There's a lot of leasing taking place, of course. But there can be other payment or banking opportunities across the value chains of electrical vehicles. For example, payments, for the charging, M&A activities, and further investment. The expectation is that about 72% of new EV financing will be loans, and the remaining little less than 30% will be leases. If you look at the built environment, there are big opportunities there as well. Now, this is an example from the Netherlands. The Dutch bank ING, they've been financing the Dutch National Heating Fund since 2014. They provide 600 million in sustainable real estate financing, and they expect to double that in the coming three years. So borrowers receive an average 1.5% discount from the going interest rate over the period. And the aim of ING is to have a green energy label by the end of this year for their entire commercial real estate portfolio. And so you can see that there's a little bit of incentivization going on, but also they looked at the performance of some of these sustainable buildings, the running costs, and some of the risks that are being seen in terms of the asset value with regulation coming up. Then there was Banco Sao Paulo in Italy. They have a dedicated strategy to something called the circular economy. Circular economy is not directly climate related. It's more focused on resource use, but it fits within the broader environmental category of ESG. And what they've been doing is to offer a dedicated credit facility for circular economy businesses and projects. And to the last time I looked was by the end of 2021, so one and a half years ago. They financed more than 400 projects to an amount of 6.5 billion euros. Also, they've been issuing a green bond for circular economy companies, and they offer knowledge. So that's another role that has been identified by my colleagues at the Cambridge Center for Sustainable Finance. Banks probably need to go beyond just providing credit and asking questions. Clients have as many questions as the banks have, and banks sit at the central point within the economy. And so what Intesa Sanpaolo very smartly does is they offer knowledge to their clients, which their clients then can use to do business. Now, while we're focusing today on some of the opportunities, we should not forget about the risk lens either. And we spoke a little bit about that. So here's net zero transition planning. So that's the operationalization of the net zero commitments at the institutional level, be that the bank or be that the client. And so that's a transition path. We're going to have less carbon emissions, both in our financed emissions as well as in operating emissions. And this is climate-related risk management. So the integration of these financial risks into the risk governance processes and strategies. Now, there's clearly an overlap between the two. If you look at transition planning and all the opportunities that come with it, and you look at climate-related risk management, both use common data, common metrics. They also talk about the same pathways. Both of them are looking at 1.5 degrees. One from a risk lens, the other from, because 1.5 degrees will, the client scientists say, is the bandwidth within which you can operate safely as humanity and as an economy. And of course, the opportunity side, net zero transitions, all the financing that needs to take place, has that as the dot on the horizon, 1.5 degrees maximum average temperature rise compared to pre-industrial levels. That's the objective, and from there the level of acceptable carbon emissions is calculated. Now, risk management practices will identify the need for transition plans, and so the planning that your clients, that the bank's clients, but also the bank itself needs to do to go to a net zero goal. You can't expect to say today, I'm going to be net zero, and then tomorrow magically you are net zero. That's not how it works. You need to have a time-based goal with objectives, not just for 15 or 20 years from now, but objectives for 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18, 24, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, etc. So risk management can identify the need to have these plans, not just say that you're going to do something, but have a solid strategy in place. And on the other hand, the implementation of a net zero transition pathway can contribute to mitigating some of the risks that we identified earlier. If you are already if you have a lower carbon footprint, you emit less greenhouse gas emissions, your impact on climate change is smaller as a company, then the odds that you will be hit negatively by incoming regulation, either within your own country or in a big bloc like the EU or the US, that chance is smaller. So that can be a mitigating action for that client, both on the physical risk side as well as the transition risk side. So the data, the metrics, the pathways. We've been talking about a high level about these, and they will be different for each bank, because each bank has a different geographical focus. Each bank has a more or less different focus in terms of the clients that they serve, and even the business model of each bank is different. Maybe more markets oriented, maybe more retail oriented, and mostly helping retail clients with maybe deposits and some mortgages. So the data that you collect, the metrics that you set, and the pathways for transition that you formulate, they will differ. But in any case, banks engage with their clients. And now, in the final part of this presentation, we're going to briefly look at an engagement model. Engagement model for the first line of defense, those colleagues that work directly with clients. And so how can you engage clients on impact? So corporates need to engage with sustainability, but their level of awareness differs. And I'm mainly talking about corporate clients here, so business clients. This is the reason that at Cambridge University, there's an initiative called the Banking Environment Initiative. I used to lead that. An engagement model was developed. And the engagement model helps bankers, client-facing bankers, to have structured conversations with their clients on sustainability, particularly on climate, particularly on net zero and transition pathways, as well as on the financing solutions that can support their clients in these transitions. So this 5-step process can be used to scope out client interest during regular client engagements of banks' account managers, assuming that for a corporate bank or bank with a corporate model, the engagement with clients will be more face-to-face than through a pure play digital engagement model. And so we're talking about slightly bigger tickets here, not just a mortgage. So the first phase is setting the scene. So you have some target outcomes. There needs to be a deeper understanding of ESG risks for the client, the opportunities that they're facing, and there needs to be alignment of on the role of how business supports societies and the national environment they operate in and rely upon. If a client can't acknowledge that they operate in and rely on society and national environment, then probably the risks that they face, that's already a red flag. The risk that they face will be large. The client-facing colleague will also identify whether the client is opening up to further conversations. Now, some questions that the account manager can ask during this phase is, does your organization already have a sustainability strategy and that articulates risks and opportunities? Core business risk and opportunities, not just doing nice things for a community, but things that are material to the business model of the client. How connected is the finance team to the sustainability strategy, risk planning, and execution of management? Or does the finance team sit separately? Do you have a treasury department here doing its own thing? And then you have management, or in some cases, maybe only a sustainability manager doing their own thing over here. That might be a red flag as well. Who needs to be in the room to be able to further assess the overlap between sustainability strategy and financing needs? It's a great question to ask. It's a very open question. The next step would be assessing any ESG issues. And you collect information to scope out areas for partnership. You come to a shared understanding of the baseline position of the client, the type of transition that the client is targeting, and that transition will be different for all these sectors that we identified. It will be different for transportation compared to agriculture. It will be different for the built environment compared to the service industry. So your colleagues, they will have different conversations depending on the client and depending on the sector they're talking to. Now, so what will be the baseline position? What type of transition is targeted? This is not a one size fits all. And how far the client has progressed today. And then you can map the strategic and operational implications of some of the risks that might emerge and the opportunities alongside financing opportunities. Then the third step would be to design a client transition plan. The outcome of this would be that the client has a plan for how they can achieve positive impact based on scientific evidence and leading sectoral practice. Banks can help with this. Regulators can help with this. There are resources available, but it can be very helpful to provide clients with the knowledge they need, because often they don't have a research department. And then appropriate targets have been, and this is in the self-interest of the bank. The alternative is that the bank says, well, we don't want to do business with this client anymore. But there are very many clients that don't have this knowledge at the moment. And so that might be a business risk to the bank as well. So the balance there. The other target outcome of this phase would be that appropriate targets have been established, which can be embedded into financial structures, products, maybe a bond, maybe a sustainability-linked loan. There's a number of sustainability and climate-related products that are out there in the market that are growing really fast and that have some kind of incentivization baked in. The fourth step, we're looking at the structuring of the financing solution. So you're looking at the solutions for your clients' current financing needs, structure them, but also take into account the longer term sustainability strategy of the client. If they need to move from one energy source or one supply chain to another, that's something to take into account into financial planning. Of course, you need to agree on the structure of the financing and the pricing. You always need to do that if you are a client facing at a bank. And then the mandate is awarded and the deal is signed. And then we come to the final step of this engagement model, and that's the review. So finance has been deployed successfully, the client is financed, and the client allocates that finance to deliver the agreed outcomes. Now, you need to have the tools also in place to monitor the progress, because if you don't, it might be that you give your clients the financing they say they need, and then if they apply the financing another way or targets are not being met, you in your loan book will still be left with that climate risk. And so some monitoring and tracking will be in order. This will be part of the ongoing client review and client engagement process. You can explore how to unlock barriers that could support commercialization of sustainable business models. There can be different ways in which you further this engagement. Now, the final slide, the key takeaways. If we think about climate risks to banks, we often tend to think in a wider framework of ESG. Within a wider framework, climate risks are coming mostly to the forefront, not least because of the Basel Committee issuing their principles that require banks to monitor, manage, mitigate, and report on the double materiality of climate. ESG must be assessed both at the counterparty level, the client, but also at the level of the bank itself. We continuously talked about these two levels. It requires significant changes in enterprise risk management, in data, and in IT architectures. You can see that principle-based regulation and supranational bodies are establishing frameworks for mandatory compliance with enforcement mechanisms. For example, Pillar 1 changes to the IRB capital adequacy models, Pillar 2 capital requirements, and non-compliance files. So companies transition to sustainable business model will provide a commercial opportunity, though they will provide a commercial opportunity for green financial products as well. And we briefly mentioned bonds, loans, IPOs. We looked at M&As. We looked at the valuation that's going to change based on evolving cash flows. And then finally, we looked at what is the first line of defense, these client-facing colleagues, what are they to do? Because a lot of all these key takeaways sit at the level of a regulator or of staff. But what do you do when you're having a cup of tea with a client? Now, for this, we had the Cambridge engagement model that can support bankers to identify opportunities for green products. It can support clients' transition to more sustainable business. and can improve impact, but at the same time, it can manage some of these risks as well. Now, with that, I want to draw my presentation to a conclusion. I want to thank you very much for being with me today to engage on some of these insights on how to manage climate-related risks from a banking perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas Verhagen. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Thomas Verhagen, for such insightful presentation, or I can say a mind-provoking presentation. If I may recap or conclude all the materials of presentation from the beginning to the end, there are three factors that influence the ESG from environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors. From the environmental factors, there are climate change, biodiversity and deforestation, resource depletions, waste and pollution. From the social factors, we have health and safety, labor standards, human rights and community, and customer responsibility. And from the governance factors, consists of some of the challenges from board independence and diversity, remunerations, tax fairness, corruptions, reporting, and transparency. And we also learned about the financial reporting and sustainability impact reporting towards the financially materiality. And there are at least two financial materiality we have to understand from financial materiality itself to impact materiality and also double materiality, that we combine those two materiality that will be influence decisions of the business on regional and outside. Financial materiality is what is the impact of what we do on our business to the external, and impact the external to our business, and double materiality that combine the each of two. And we also learn about the Basel principles that I'm pretty sure that all of the participants on this panel discussion have already familiar with the Basel principles that indicate the climate risks that have to be prioritized by the C-level of management, not only by the sustainability managers. And we also learned about the framework, the IT architecture data that we have to collect to make the framework to mitigate the risks of the ESG. And that those Basel principles consist of identify, monitor, and also manage. And then we can set the limits and also the threshold of how to define the materiality of our business on the banking sector. And also, there are many questions that are already there in our Q&A features that we will discuss more later on the Q&A panel. But to discuss more about this ESG effect, the understanding the effect of climate change and how to mitigate it, I will be delightful to invite Ms. Veronique Chaplin from LIBF to be our second panelist on today's agenda. But before that, I will give a short introduction about Ms. Veronique Chaplin. She is an expert in financial markets, investment management, CSR, corporate governance, and extra financial rating. She holds a master's degree in international businesses, an advanced master degrees in banking and finance, and an executive MBA in CSR management and organizational performance. She is also 5001 certified for energy management and efficiency. She has worked for rating agencies, bank, and multinational companies for more than 17 years. Her vision is to work from a transdisciplinary perspective, bringing together governments, businesses, scientists, and local communities to build sustainable solutions through targeted investment and sustainable development projects. Veronique is initiating a research project which focuses on conservation finance and natural capital issues for central banks. Her ultimate goal is to raise awareness of the complex challenges facing our planet and design innovative and applied solutions for a more sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Veronique Chaplin. Hi, Mr. Roddick, how are you?
Hello, selamat petang, good afternoon.
Selamat datang, good afternoon. Thank you very much for making your time to this panel discussion session. So we've heard Bapak Iman Shah and also Mr. Thomas explain about the ESG of understanding and also how to mitigate it in our business. So yeah, Mr. Thomas, you said about the Basel principles, how to mitigate is to set the limits and define materiality of thresholds. Can you give a sort of examples how we can, define the materiality of thresholds to manage the Basel principles?
Thank you first to Professor Imensha and Yondi for this quick introduction, and I'm glad you to join me today. Yeah, we had great insight from Thomas today about materiality. This is all a journey, by the way. Materiality is just to set the scene and just to see where are the global limits and environments of the corporations, and as well as to see to scope where are the main stakeholders. So it is all a journey, and each, as Thomas said, each corporation has its own constraints and its own risk and opportunities. So this is a very special introversy kind of journey, and this is effectively the best way to get started with, because if you want to change the world, you have to get to know yourself first, and where are your strengths and where are your risks.
So like it's stated before, you have to, set the time period of your goals to be, zero emissions company. But Mr. Thomas, do you have any additional about the threshold materiality itself? I think you're still in mute. Yeah, Thomas, you are still in mute.
Yeah, sorry, my mouse had its own wheel. Sorry, Aldi. Yeah, no, thank you for this question. I think for each point, as a risk manager, the first step would be to take a structured approach. I would think you want to know what the landscape is that you are looking at. So as a bank, I would expect a bank and its risk management to be sighted on its portfolio, what geographies the financing is taking place in, what provinces, what countries, maybe what cities. There will be historical data available on some of the physical risks and also some forward-looking data on the physical risk for these geographies. So you can start to map that and then do a reality map, identify where the biggest risk sits, geography-wise. Similarly, you can start to look at the sectors that you're exposed to. Now, if you are strongly exposed to agriculture, like for example, there's this bank called Rabobank. It's a big agricultural bank. Their exposure to deforestation or to, for example, nitrogen emissions is much larger than. Proportionally is much larger than a bank that is mainly focused on financing real estate. Real estate will have a different profile. So what you can do then is also look at the sector, as I said, the sector profile, and to align with 1.5 degrees, there are initiatives out there, particularly something called Science-Based Targets Initiative, which sits in Paris. And that translates the objectives, super high level objectives of the Paris Agreement. It translates it into mini objectives and pathways for different industries, for the built environment and transportation, for example. And then you can start to map, okay, what are the carbon exposures of these industries within the sector. There are specific tools being provided by the Paris by the Science-Based Target Initiative, particularly one called PACTA, Paris Aligned Capital Transition, something with an A. Yeah, I forgot the A. But you can run your portfolio to some of these tools. The other one is PICAF and PACTA. So I can't say this is the metric for each and every bank. It's unique indicated. It's going to be unique. But I can point you to look at the geographies, look at the sectors, and then maybe look at these tools that are available, including the ones from
Yeah.
science-based.
Is there any tools or measurement that we can use to, really define the business of our clients or debtors, so we can really see that they already implement the ESG or net zero emission on their business?
Veronica for me. Veronica, do you want to go? Shall I go?
Oh yeah,
What's
yeah. Apparently you may
what's your
answer
preference?
first, Veronica. Yeah.
So is that for me?
Yeah, is there any tools or measurement that we can use to really define our clients and customers have really implementing the ESG on their business?
Oh, it's a quite a wide question, depending on which kind of environment, social or governance funds you're sending. I would say that to get started with, you want to focus on GHG. We may start with use the protocol such as the greenhouse gas protocol or the PCAF, and maybe also start with the TCFD just to get a start with that. But I would just like to come back to the beginning of the question, and I would like to maybe to give more steps to our audience, just to make it a bit clear, because I've been maybe a bit general in my answer. I would say that in this process of materiality assessment, I just, as Thomas said, you have to identify your key business areas, and then you have to make this map for your climate risk and opportunities, as I mentioned. And then you have to, once you have identified all this, you have then to engage, as Thomas noticed as well. And then you can make a fully thorough, appropriate risk and opportunities map. And you have to prioritize based on the materiality. And that's when the process is interesting, because you have to cross between your stakeholders' material points and your own material points as an organization, and with the level of risk you're eager to take, as Thomas explained. So, and this is when it is very interesting, and that's when you get to integrating all these findings, and you finally kind of more or less clear map of what is the outlook of your risk, and then you can start to monitor and count and just monitor and report and just go back to the beginning. So that is all the process about sustainable growing, all the journey is about. Maybe I will be a bit more clear.
Yeah, all right. Mr. Thomas, about the pathway to transition, which are you think the most crucial parts of the journey of the pathway of the transition to the zero emission?
I think the most crucial part is awareness, both at the level of the bank and at the level of the client. If you are unaware, if you are ignorant of the risks that you take, or the risks that you impose on your surroundings, then how are you going to manage it, right? So it starts with high-level knowledge, like we're sharing here today. Then you move to more granular knowledge to look at the specific situation of your bank, like we discussed just now. Look at your geographies. What are the physical risks? What are the transition risks? Is there sector concentration? Like, I don't know, there might be a certain region in Indonesia that has a very strong concentration of one sector, and that sector might be sensitive to either physical risk or transition risks. So is there a sector concentration? And then within that geography, and of course, I'm looking at the sector concentrations within your portfolio as well. All of that is to do with increasing your knowledge, increasing your awareness, and going to a much more granular level. And then the next step, of course, is to start engaging, to prioritize the clients to engage with, and prioritize your appetite.
All right.
Your appetite, and then engage these clients. It's an ever expanding awareness, insight, knowledge, and therefore agency, being able to act. If you don't know, if you don't have the awareness, how are you going to have the agency to act and to manage your risks? I don't see that.
Okay. Let's go to Ms. Veronique. We've seen that World Economic Forum, our central banks have already put big concern on the climate risk challenges on a worldwide scale and also on a regional scale. How do you think about the, like Mr. Thomas said, the awareness of the investors and clients about these climate change risks and how it will be, it will be influence the reputation of the bank sector?
So may I reformulate the question? So your question is about
the awareness of the investors and also customers of the climate risk challenges.
Other factors except from those from regulations or any kind of physical risk, so other than transition and physical risk may affect the willingness of the institutional finance institutions to go to that way. I think it's all going back to materiality. We see that what's been lead on by the insurance sector in Macaulay going back to 2015 or so, it's just about materiality and just noticing that first it's not sustainable anymore on the business point of view. On the other hand, there is this, as Thomas said, this kind of double materiality because it also matters for the public. So you had many levels on which may have an influence. So there is this kind of regular and all these things in regulation matters. There is also the systemic risk about the sector. There is also the feeling of the public that is changing. This is also a kind of transition risk, right? So it is a whole system that is evolving, I would say, and there are so many impetus, apart from those, of course, of the supranational, which are doing such a work to just help and lead all the sectors and the finance and the banks being at the heart of this living system that is the economy are for sure on the forefront. So it started with a kind of self-initiative from a bank and then asset managers and investors. That was going back to 2015 or so, because at that time corporates were not so much aware that investors were forming these alliances about ESG risk and what was on the horizon as well, and not simply stranded assets. It was a whole matter. But at the end of the day, I would go back to the public because all these organizations are made for the good of the communities. So raising awareness, as you mentioned, is very important. It is important on the organizational side, be it on the corporate sector or be it on the banking sector. And it has to be infused from the head to toe and toe to head. That means from the board and leading capacity building for the whole colleagues and teams, and being aware as well at what the client is needed and as well the individuals and the communities are needing. So it is much as well grassrooted, sorry. And this is where I think banks, and especially local banks, can start initiative. So it is not only because of legislations, it is because the sentiment of the public. And I've noticed in the question box that some persons were just wondering whether we can manage at the same time development and sustainable development. And this is the heart of the question, and especially in Indonesia. And it is there. I am very optimistic because there are so many ways turning up, and we are just at the corner of doing something very successful for developing countries with the help of sustainable finance.
I think we all agree about the awareness of the ESG and climate change effect on our business and also investor and clients. Mr. Thomas, can you explain to us how we can create, ESG control across the multiple functions of our company?
Is that a question to me?
To Mr. Thomas. Yeah, and then you can add some points after Mr. Thomas.
Yeah. So what I've seen at banks across many countries and many regions in the world is that it starts with a centralized approach. So you need to speak one language. You need to have a shared understanding of what it is you're looking at. You need to also understand what the responsibilities of the different departments and the different roles are. Clearly, our client-facing colleagues will have a different role from auditing colleagues. You also need to have a little bit, given that this is something that we found with research with a number of leading banks while at Cambridge. What you also need is an ability to work across functional boundaries. Like if you want to issue a new type of loan with a sustainability component or a climate component integrated in that loan, then clearly the people that have the knowledge about climate or about sustainability within the bank need to be able to speak the language and work together and understand the needs of the people that develop products. And maybe you also need, both of them need to understand the needs and the language that's being spoken of the people that sit within the treasury department of the bank that is going to raise the funding for a product, for example. A bit of a tragic example, but there was a product that was a very well designed product but in Indonesia by BNP Paribas. It was landscape-based financing, so there was a whole landscape that was being financed. The restoration of the landscape was being financed. There were a lot of outside parties involved as well, NGOs, the UN, WWF. It was called the TLFF, the product. And I looked at that product and I thought it was really innovative. It was a bit revolutionary. What happened was that there wasn't very good due diligence beforehand. So it wasn't clear that the landscape was destroyed just really briefly before the product was issued, and then a scandal broke out, and the product was liquidated. Was taken out of the market. But what that product entailed, just as an illustration, really not at the 10,000 feet level, but on the ground level, what that product did, it required knowledge about what that landscape looks like. So biological knowledge, ecological knowledge. It required deep engagement with communities living in that landscape. Then there was a rubber plantation, which would be integrated with landscape restoration. There was a guaranteed rubber offtake by Michelin, a big tire company. Then the loans, the financing would be structured in a special purpose vehicle, and then a special purpose vehicle would be securitized and turned into a bond issue with different tiers of risk and different return for specific private wealth clients in the Hong Kong office of RIBA for Southeast Asia clients. I thought it was a fantastic product, except for the due diligence. You can see that the types of knowledge and the types of collaboration that's needed across traditional boundaries is much larger than when normal financing and normal lending. So the type of working with colleagues, working with knowledge, combining and connecting knowledge is much more intense, and the type of engaging clients on that knowledge or with the finance clients is much more intense than you would have with more traditional financing. And there might be a role for an institute like the OJK Institute, I think, as well, in identifying how these new products and how these new structures can be integrated into the banks. A role comes to mind, traditional role in organization studies called a boundary spanner. That is a person who's able to connect different worlds, different fields of knowledge, different roles and responsibilities in a way that they can flow and that they can generate value. Maybe there's something to be said that you need some boundary spanners within the banks as well. Anyway, that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry, apologies.
It's okay, Mr. Rani, do you have any additional answer to the question of climate risk control across the multiple function of our organization and how it reflected in our products? Yeah, Ms. Fernie? I think you are still in mute.
Sorry, I was not really focused. May I ask you to come again with the question? I was not really focused on that.
The climate risk control across the multiple function of our organization and how it reflected in our products, in banking products in particular.
Oh, it's a wide question. So, climate risk control over all the classes.
Of the on our organization, across the multiple function of our organization, on the bank industry.
Okay, so you mean by control you may mean management, because control may be a bit difficult to achieve. So maybe go about this before to control. You have to understand and make sure about what we are thinking about and where we can stand as an organization. Just to go through all the, of course, as Thomas mentioned, all through the to the loan portfolio, to the investment, to the business operation, and maybe as well the OTC operation. So to the bank anyway has to, referring to the basic principle, has to be transparent about all the risk it is willing to take, and this has of course to be measured about all the portfolio exposure, and as well on the corporate side, on the collateral side, on the retail side. So, and this has to be managed and overseen, and for this we need a lot of data. We need to include the risk managers in the topic, just for them to be able to analyze this with the help, of course, of an integrated framework and IT organization that will give a good lookout about what is going to, and of course to see what's going on with finance facilitated emission. And on the other side, it's interesting to see how much bank can also be as financing or asset managing, see how they can be as well be a contributor of reducing the GHG emission through selling green products. So there is a lot of things to be done.
Yes.
On the asset management side, I would say maybe for the retail banking, it will be through the selling of funds, or maybe for the private and high net individual banking, it can be through, as Thomas mentioned, through the participation of bespoke products with a focus on out of the usual scope, such as conservation products or anything. And it can be as well helping the corporates on the corporate side, of course, to set up their risk assessment as well, and accompany them in a green project, or being on a brown going to green project. And then we also go up to the sovereigns, because there as well there is much to do, and there is a lot of focus being made on blended finance solutions, and there is the solution as well, because as Thomas mentioned, this is a transboundary process, and
whole scale level.
Yeah, we have to go out the usual way of manage this. And for instance, going for blended finance would be interesting for maybe, let's say, states or government taking the more risky side of the thing, and then allowing other lenders to come on the project with the help of funding from supranationals, and etc., etc. So it's very exciting, but it's all bespoke. And what is very interesting in finance, that anything can be built, but it has to be built on transparency.
Yeah, of all the processes and the structure that we have to create, the data that we collect, and also the pathway. Do you have any examples of best practices that the banks have implemented to, manage the climate risk evac? Ms. Veronique?
come again, because my sound is not very good. Can you come again and
Yeah,
reform?
can you give any sort of examples of best practices that leading banks have implemented to, manage the climate risk?
Oh, that is it's always the same process. It's first about knowing getting to know yourself. There is the main initiators, kind of leaders. I won't give name, but it always starts with getting to know yourself, reporting about yourself, and then getting to know your customers. So you it's the usual process is to be completely transparent about your own carbon footprint, getting into your scope 1, scope 2, and then develop the whole process of evaluation, and then report on this and go back again. So this is the so if you want to go, I'm not sure at that point on how precise I can be into the response, because there will be later other points that will maybe overcrossing. So I try to be quite general now, and maybe later I can be a bit deeper into my answer.
Okay, Thomas, you have some additional points to the questions of the best practices, the examples of leading banks that already done to reduce to manage the climate risk. Yeah.
And I am mute. Thank you for bearing with me, Aldi. So yes, I think that one of the ways that banks can hedge the risks is by evolving their loan portfolios now already. Like I gave this example of the real estate lending business in 2008. One of the big risks that we saw was that we would be the last one in the market having very lenient financing terms for real estate while the market was going sour. And all of the bad risks would flow to us, right? So a way to counter that is to proactively offer the types of solutions that are being developed in the market. And you can think about well, you can think about the origination of green bonds. Of course, that doesn't flow into the loan book of the banks. But you have sustainability-linked loans. There is green real estate financing, green mortgages. Depending on your market, there can be green sustainable leasing. So all kinds of steps you can take, such that at least on the asset side of your the assets that you finance and the companies that you finance will be less exposed, at least to transition risks. Physical risks, you really need to think hard, because they will be localized. There will be specific physical risks for Jakarta. There will be other physical risk for in Sumatra. That will vary. So navigating that is a matter of classical risk management. But if you look at transition risks, you can also lean in heavy on the opportunity side. And what I see is, for example, a bank like ING is doing that. Like Lloyds Bank in the UK is doing that as well. I can see that a bank like DBS in Singapore is moving in that direction as well. So there are examples of banks out there that are doing that.
Yeah, in Indonesia, actually, our Minister of Finance just launched the emission transition mechanism for energy sector. It's to accelerate the net zero emission in 2060 as the target of our government. So how do you think about it? The emission transition mechanism that already built in Indonesia. How can we imply it to the banking sector or non-banking sector in the financial industry? Mr. Thomas, you may answer first.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. I think I would look at the timelines. I would take into account whether these timelines right now is 2060. That is not very. If you look at the objectives of other countries, that it's a little bit further away than the objectives of other countries, even though many of them focus on 2050, which is also a bit further away. The expectation in the market is that there might be a moving of those timelines. So it's 2050 or 2060 now, it might become 2045, 2040. There's a little bit of a political process taking place, sensitizing market players to the fact that a transition is going to take place. So that's something to take into account, I think, as a bank. Do you expect this to really happen on a time horizon of 2060? Because then you wouldn't worry about it. If it needs to fully happen.
How long do you think the realistic period that a banking sector could estimate it to really implement the climate risk framework that we already talked about?
I think a bank can start implementing that. The duration of a portfolio of a bank, depending on the market. But I know that some banks hold mortgages to maturity, so then you have a 30-year exposure. But most loans sit somewhere between 3 to 5 years. So you can turn over all of your portfolio within 5 years, 7 years. So that's not possible. The question, of course, is the risks that you take, because you would say yes to assets into companies, to technologies, to products, to business models that might not have been completely proven yet. So there's a risk. But I think in terms of transition, 5 years, if you just look at the tenor of financing and the duration, that would be possible. Now, of course, there's a massive change program that you need to do in your IT, in your data management. Policy changes can be relatively quick. You need to do a lot of policy within banks, and you can do that relatively quick. Risk appetite setting you can do relatively quick as well. So if there's a will, there's a way, people sometimes say. And that's something I think that would be worthwhile for people with banks to keep in the back of their minds, that regulators also know that this time horizon might be possible. And if the physical risks become too big, just last week there was some data coming through about the observation of temperature rises in the top levels of the Atlantic Ocean, which have been spiking massively. And that's a potential climate tipping point, leading to much more extreme weather events, etc.
Yeah, and we also experience the heat stroke now in Southeast Asia.
Sorry, the what? El Nino.
We also experience heat stroke in Southeast Asia lately because of the climate change.
Yeah, look at a couple of months ago in India as well, and look at what's happening in California with commercial parties moving away from insuring real estate in California. California is the economic heart of America. That's what we're talking about. So I think that policymakers know that they can push that very fast button. Say, okay, your tenor is this many years. We know that it takes you a couple of months to write a policy. You can do it even quicker. During the financial crisis, you can write a policy on a Sunday afternoon. Of course, regulators rather not push that button, but I think it would be, and I'm going to use a big word here, but I think it would be unwise of banks to think that you can just sit until 2060 and move it out. It can accelerate.
Yeah, we've seen now
physically or in the market, it can happen any moment, and then that regulatory button or the change button will be pushed. Yeah, will you be prepared? Do you want to be prepared for that or not? That's the question. And I think
we've seen now the climate change mitigation is shifting from the voluntary to mandatory to banking industry and to all of us. Yeah, Mr. Nick, I will move on to you about the products of the climate risk mitigation, green bonds. How do you see the successful of green bonds on regional area, and how do you see another products of the climate change mitigation of banking?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, green bond, sustainable bonds as a general are a great tool to go together in that direction of sustainable development. And so I would like to. We usually speak about green bonds, which are the usual thing, which are green bond rapidly are bonds which are dedicated to a special project with a use of proceeds. This project may be environmental, social, or both, etc. And we have also kind of there is a wealth already. There is a wealth of bespoke and going more diverse kind of tool that can fit to any kind of need, and this is a very good thing. Today, I would like to take this opportunity to speak about something that is not much shared, but it has been on the for some time, and I think it's particularly of interest for Indonesia, as Indonesia is 17 town or more islands. So I would like to talk about blue economy and what is linked to this blue economy for all these green bond or sustainability linked bond, and that can be interesting because there is now a framework of more so that has been settled, and this blue label. It can be dedicated to improve any kind of industries related to the blue economy. Blue economy has been really approximatively evaluated of worth of something was 175 billion a year, and what is really addressed in this sector would be only 55 trillion a year only. So there is much to be done, and we are talking about what's going on with development and green and sustainable development. This is where this kind of tool can be very useful, because then we can tap into, for instance, let's go for some issues, some industry that are in the seafood industry, for instance, Maui, that has lately launched 200 million bond in January. So it's an unsecured green bond, but it's dedicated to its performance as a company going into the sustainability way, and this will allow him to get better finance capital. It also, so it's most of the time linked to the performance of the company, but it can be a use of proceeds for a special project. So what I try to do say there, that for this blue economy to be really considered, because it can be a level of development, and because it can be a level of development of the communities, it is very interesting, and because it will be addressing the threat of what's going on with the high acute and extreme weather conditions. So let's talk about the rise of the sea levels towards Jakarta, for instance, and most of the inhabitants of the low coast are exposed to. So this is really crucial, and this is, I think, a really a good way to investigate, and very little bit as it has been done in that field. So I've been talking about blue bond because this is the fine line on the total thing. I would say that Asia more or less accounts for 1/4 of the sustainable bond market. This market has been quite sluggish last year because there has been quite a lot of volatility, but I think it's bouncing back. And what is interesting to see is that the sovereign are getting in, and that is it is a maturing market for some of the instruments. There is a lot of instruments because you're not obligated to go to the market. You can go to your bank as well when you are SME to get a sustainable linked loan, for instance. So there is a lot of possibility to be done. What could I say as well is that there is a lot that is done in that field in terms of innovation by South America and South American banks, and that can be as well a source of inspiration for Southeast Asia, and particularly when it goes to conservation and biodiversity concepts, because biodiversity is a new with a new topic in mind, and we know and acknowledge that the ultimate wealth is life on Earth, and that's why now all the central banks are getting that topic into their thinking process to see how we can manage this and to enable a sustainable development that is sustainable with the planet boundaries. So that's another issue as well.
So how can we really connect the climate change mitigation to the blue economy that you've just explained, that it will really help reduce the climate change risk and also really helps to boost the businesses itself, Ms. Vernie?
So I'm sorry, my sound is not very clear. So can you just come again and
yeah. How can we really combine the mitigations of climate risk and the blue economy that you just explained to really boost the business of banking industry and also really can help to mitigate the climate risk itself?
So yeah, so starting from the bank side, as Thomas said, we have to go into the sectors that are the more exposed. So to do that, you can be helped by the green taxonomy that Indonesia and OJK has launched. So this is a great tool to be just to get started. So then you can engage to the most exposed sector. But blue economy is just a bit out of the line, and it may not occur immediately, even though oceans are one of the most carbon sinks, and because of all the impacts that we have. And to say that when we go to sustainable bonds, and when we look at the row of all the SDGs, most of them are quite more or less covered, but SDG 14, which is conserve and protect life on the sea, is not that much addressed. So it would be a great interest for the banks, for instance, to go and engage with their customers that are linked to this sector, and I mean fishery, I mean everything that is linked, I mean infrastructure, I mean everything that is linked to this marine and blue economy, and engage and then see what's possible. So for instance, when it goes to let's say make sure like the infrastructure, the harbor is not sinking, so you can engage with a local governance and see what can be done, then set up a kind of a plan and involve in that the local companies just to adapt and make an infrastructure project, introducing in foreign investors, because the country has been making proof that it has a sound, precise map and regulation in place that allow foreign investors to go through a very clear and transparent and very efficient and measurable plan for them. So then they can invest their capital, and then that can be the way this big capital that need to be invested, actually, because wealth but the point is the size of the project. So we have to go top down and bottom up. Go back to the roots, see exactly what has to be done. As Thomas said, go with the communities, go with the scientists. For instance, in the conservation, there's much to be done as well. So that's how it can be done. And when we consider what all that has to be achieved by Indonesia, that is still in its way to development, I think it is an opportunity, because it is a way to take the good road and to go the good way. For instance, for the road to Nusantara, and to go try to go for this plan for cutting, phasing out coal and getting into more marine. So it can be, for instance, generated renewable energy from marine source. It can be lots of things to be imaged. So you have to put in some capital. You have to put some capital to find some new disruptors, new technologies, and they are all there. And it is there is this treaty about high sea, and this is which is very encouraging. So, but to get started with, when the beach, the first thing you have to tackle is what? It is waste. You can go to a beach where you can find all this plastic. So it's all linked in. So yes, there is great opportunities on every side. And as Thomas said, you have to get into the thing and find a way just to gather all these topics and make the connections.
So there is.
Yeah, so it's a bit the way I'm trying to work on my side. It's raise awareness, design, and action for rescue.
So there is really an evidence that if we do those efforts, that it will attract more of the FDI and also capital. All right. I will move on to Mr. Thomas. As Bapak Imansyah stated earlier, the situation in Indonesia, there are at least 3 challenges that we face towards implementing the climate risk mitigations and also climate risk efforts. Those are the lack of risk assessment, lack of standardizations, and also lack of experts. Is there any ways we can really fulfill the lack of the risk assessment and also standardization and as well expert in our country to really, understand and implementing the ESG efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Bapak Aldi, for that, and thanks, Bapak Imansyah, for clarifying these challenges that are faced by the Indonesian banking sector. I think they are related. No? If you want to assess, you need to have some knowledge and expertise. And if you want to standardize, you need to have knowledge and expertise as well. So it seems like it's downstream from knowledge again, to the point you and I discussed earlier. There is, I think that it's very well possible for banks to compile the teams that are needed. If you don't have sustainability focused people, that might be a challenge. It might be needed to either retrain some existing banking colleagues or to hire more multidisciplinary teams as well. If I look at the big consultancy firms globally, Deloitte, EY, PwC, KPMG, where in the past they used to hire business graduates, specifically accounting and sometimes strategy graduates, or graduates that did traditional like elite type subjects like classics in the UK. What I see in their practice, and when I talk to some of the partners that I work with there, increasingly they're hiring biologists, they're hiring human rights specialists, they are hiring climate scientists, they're hiring geologists. So you see that the knowledge base of these knowledge intensive consultancies is expanding. I would expect something similar to happen within banks, and I've seen something similar happen, particularly within the Dutch banks, where you see that the hiring practices at the graduate level starts to become broader beyond traditional law and business graduates. That's one way. You won't have an expert by hiring someone who studied biology, but what you can have is someone who can filter out nonsense. That can be one strand, new hiring practices, expanding the scope. The second is training people, and I think that OJK Institute plays an excellent role here. There are additional resources out there in the market. Principles of responsible banking. We have LIBF, of course, working closely with OJK. There's a principles of responsible banking academy. There are different sources out there which can be a bit more granular sometimes than the broad training that also needs to take place. Assessment needs to be a collaboration between existing expertise who understand how credit risk works and how maybe changes to market risk might work, asset valuation or changes in cash flow. and people who have this background in more ESG sustainability and climate knowledge. So I think there might also be a role to involve NGOs. Banks can work with NGOs. In the past, maybe there's been a relationship which in some instances will have been a little bit more tense. But if you think about NGOs as a spectrum, you have anything from, on one end of the spectrum, very confronting NGOs, Greenpeace or Extinction Rebellion, and on the other end of the spectrum, very collaborative NGOs. And then you can think about WWF or some other NGOs that are out there. They have a lot of knowledge and they are very keen to collaborate with banks. So if you need expertise, sometimes maybe the expertise, if you have a bank and maybe you have 1,000 employees or you have 100,000 employees, always there will be more knowledge and expertise outside of the walls of your bank than inside of the walls of the bank. So you can think about so-called open innovation models or more open knowledge models in which you involve parties like these NGOs as well. So that's a way to access expertise. And then assessment and standardization will be a dynamic process. You won't come to standard at once if you don't have knowledge or you don't have the expertise. I would expect that regulators, I can't look in the agenda or in the planning of the OJK, but I would expect regulators across the globe to play a role in standardization by providing good practices, by basically asking all the players in the market, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing? Then make a list of the best stuff that is happening out there. And then as a bank, you have a menu, right? So that can also play a role in standardization. So to summarize, I think it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a cocktail of ingredients and also assessment, standardization, expertise. The same issues play out in other markets than Indonesia as well.
Yeah, I think
it's going to be expertise. It's going to be a mix of institutes like the OJK Institute, getting outside expertise with knowledge institutions like NGOs or universities, think tanks, working together as banks. In Europe, they're changing competition law right now to allow companies to work together to counter climate change.
Speak one language, work together. As you said,
work together, but in the past, if you work together, you could get a very big fine. You can be punished because of conspiracy to corner a market, right? To work against competition. European legislation is changing now. Legislation in the UK is being re-evaluated. The regulators are starting to think differently about what priority they need to set in a market. So institutes like OJK Institute work with NGOs, work with your industry peers, and that's increasingly being allowed. Recognize that you need to upskill your existing team, but also look at hiring different profiles. Recognize that standardization also can the regulator, so not the OJK or DNB, the Netherlands, ECB, can play a role by communicating good practices. I think all of that needs to be, all the ingredients need to be put in the mix to come to a solution.
It will be a lot of more easier.
These are very complex issues. I hope you don't mind.
It will be a lot more easier if our company or banking sector have already prioritized the climate risk mitigation itself. Ms. Veronica, just a brief answer. How do you think to fulfill the lack of risk assessment and transition to zero emission and ESG? Short answer. You are still mute, Ms. Veronica.
So may I rephrase? Sorry, I didn't get you exactly. So can you
how we fulfill the lack of self risk assessment, the lack of risk assessment to navigate the climate risk?
So how to assess the lack of self-assessment to navigate. I think it's just starting by reporting as well. It's always the same path. it's a very broad question, so I was something a bit more narrow. I would say that we may go into and drill into the activities and through the risk and through the sectors and see finally where are the big lags and where we should be putting the stress on. I think we should as well evaluate and see what should be done and just to see how we can align on the countries as well as a global path, and we can maybe just check and see if we are just really on this path to net zero, and we may after doing this materiality assessment and all the risk framework and analysis, and then we are ready, as most advanced financial institutions are ready to elaborate a scenario analysis, and then this scenario will allow you to see if you are really on the track of the net zero, ideally on the inside the boundaries of the planet with the SBTI and science-based target. So this is very interesting, and then maybe ideally it would be to say, okay, we may be a force for change, and for instance, if we look into what's needed for renewable, for instance, most are supposed to be 25% of the mix by 2025, and for now we are just 11%. So President Jokowi lately in Brussels just made this nice announcement, and should be 30% for 2030, if I'm right. So now we say, now we have to focus into renewable energy. So what can be done into renewable energy? Let's go and see if there are any kind of new guys on the block bringing new energy, new possibilities, and there are many. I could just think of maybe there are some initiatives and innovation that allow to transform plastic into fuel. So that would be a great opportunity for local communities to solve at the same time the issue on waste and the issue on fuel. So that's a kind of initiative that can lead to the good way for the bank to reach this its own target, and these banks being embedded into the whole country's goal with their NDCs, which are quite ambitious too. So for 2050, and the finance minister are just even made it a bit shorter. So yeah, this is a whole thing, and just go back to basics and look where the needs are, and focus on what's needed to and make a scenario. I would say the more advanced financial institutions and banks are now on the point, or are they able to go to a scenario analysis and a transition plan. Transition plan is almost, and it's what to be done now. Once the governance has been done, when the strategy and risk has been evaluated, now we have to work and not simply assess. Once it's done, just measure and find a goal and find the right path to the right way, because we may want to be better, but it may be not sufficient to be inside the limits of the boundaries of the planet. So it has to be science-based, and it has to be thought.
Yeah, we see the opportunity, we see the challenges, and we need to create the strategy of the pathway transition to gain that zero emission effort and initiative, so that we can increase our business and also save our next generations to the climate change effect. Thank you very much, all the panelists, to this session. Now we will move on to the Q&A sessions. As we see here, we've already received a lot of questions from our participants. Now we start our Q&A sessions, ladies and gentlemen. As I said earlier, you may type a question via Q&A feature with the format, your name, institutions, and the name of the speaker. We move to the first question from Bapak Patuan Suprayogi from Bank Mandiri. He has 3 questions. Maybe I will read one of them. The question is, considering your expertise, from Bapak Patuan to Mr. Thomas Verhagen, considering your expertise in guiding PIS on their ESG agenda and policies, what approach do you consider to be the most effective for the Indonesian financial sector in addressing climate-related risks associated with its carbon initiative portfolio, taking into account the sector's presence and the timeline required to achieve net zero emissions? Yeah, so Thomas, do you get the question?
Yeah, I'm writing it down, yeah, so what's the most effective approach? I think that the way I've seen banks and the banking sector approach market-wide change is either being told top down what to do. I don't think that's going to work here, because the benefit of a regulator, the top down party, is that they have an oversight of the market, but they don't know anything more than anybody else. They know what each individual party is doing, and therefore they have this overview. But it's not that they know what's going to happen in the future, or they have some further advanced knowledge. So that would point towards many banks taking different approaches, then these approaches being collected by the OJK or by the regulator, and then being put into an overview of good and best practices. I think that's hopefully not, I hope not too disappointing answer. I don't think that there's one approach that's going to win it, because we just don't know yet. You know, that's fundamentally uncertain. In general, high level, I think it's crucial for a bank to work with the specific characteristics of its business model and its portfolios. So as we discussed, Veronique mentioned this before, you mentioned it, I talked about it. You need to start looking at your regional exposures. You need to start looking at the type of assets that you finance. You need to start looking at the sectors that you finance. You need to start looking at the size of your client, the client profiles that you're looking at. It makes a very big difference if you're financing golden arguably resources, or whether you're financing mortgages for middle class people. Totally different business model. So I think stay true to that. Tailor your approach to that. Study and learn, and maybe get some consultants in to identify what the big risks are for the geography, for the sectors, for the client bases that you're servicing, and then start to move from there. Also, don't make this a side of a desk assignment. Don't ask someone within reporting to do this for 1 day a week, because that's not going to work. You need to dedicate resources to this. Summarizing, I think out loud sometimes, so apologies for that, but tailor your approach to the profile of your bank, geography, industries, and type of clients, and allocate resources to it. Don't ask someone to do it on the side of the desk, because that's not possible.
Can you then provide an example based on your experience on how bank can mitigate physical risk within its portfolio? Alternatively, are there any models that have been successfully implemented by banks to address physical risk? How do you see, Mr. Thomas?
Yeah, so there's something really interesting happening here. In that you can, if you think about traditional risk management, you have 4 flavors, right? So you can avoid risk, you can mitigate risk, you can transfer risk, or you can accept risk. These are the 4 flavors you have in risk management, more or less. For physical risk, depending on the size of the risk, you can decide to accept it, but then you would need to integrate that into your pricing model. Right? The pricing would need to be way higher to balance the risk out, and in many instances, you won't be able to price yourself in such a way that you can protect yourself against difficulties. So accepting is difficult. Avoiding you can do, but that means that you would not provide financing to certain clients or to certain regions, very likely regions, or certain sectors within certain regions because of the exposures. In Indonesia, that's going to be tricky because of the the concentration of population and industry in low-lying areas, as Veronique indicated. Right? So there might be the flooding risks, the physical risk can be considerable. So you won't
face it and create a strategy.
Yeah, you won't be able to withdraw from all of the Indonesian economy. That's not going to happen. Well, I don't know. I don't think that would be a viable strategy for an Indonesian bank. So then you start to move towards transferring risk. Can you insure? Can you buy insurance, or can you make sure that your client buys insurance? Then you get that situation that you've seen or you might get the situation that we've seen in California, with insurance becoming too expensive to provide coverage. Then mitigation might be some mitigations that might be in place, but I think that you almost need to start to think out of the box here. So some of the work that we did at CISL was trying to set up collaborations between the banking sector and the insurance sector to share knowledge and data. You know, the physical risk databases are available. You can analyze these. The question is, who has an interest in increasing those physical risks? It might be the insurance companies. They might be your best friends in this. There might be an approach, which is an innovation approach, to combine the knowledge and combine the incentives of these two. So that's the thing that we explored. Another thing we can start to look at is physical mitigation. So would it make sense for a bank if they have a lot of mortgages in a certain region? For example, we did some research in the UK. Would it make sense to invest in flood management? And so to finance, actively start financing flood management businesses, even though they might need a little support from a development institution or from the government. You know, that's possible. And you can start to talk to development institutions to take off the biggest risk of water management, flood management infrastructure. So some of that investment can be focused on something they call adaptation in climate change, adaptation. So you know that the physical risk is going to come. How can you make sure that it's as small as possible? Is there an investment case there? So yeah, as I said, Pak Aldi, it's a tricky one, physical risk, because we can't escape the planet. and we can't.
What we can do is just to navigate and mitigate.
Yeah, mitigation is a thing. But I think adaptation and being strategic about where you invest in terms of adaptation as a bank might increasingly rise to the agenda, and that's a super strategic discussion. You can't expect one risk manager who sits in a risk committee who needs to approve a risk credit proposal to make that decision. That's super strategic and needs to sit at the level of the bosses.
All right, so I wish that answer the question, Bapak Patuan Suprayogi from Bank Mandiri. We will move to another question because we still have a lot of questions coming up to our panel. The next question is from Ibu Adelia Pratiwi. This is the question to all speakers. Any standard like general provision, etc., that could be applied for all banks in Indonesia to acknowledge the climate risk, because there could be variation in our human resource capacity. Now, Indonesian banks are concentrated in 4 biggest banks, 50% of national bank assets. This has implication in the ability of calculating complicated risks. That's why now, for example, on estimating future credit loss in IFRS 9, Indonesia tends to over-provision, especially medium and small banks. This is like statement followed by question. Ms. Veronique, you want to answer first?
Oh, yes, sure, with pleasure. It's a great question. I would say that we just acknowledge that actually OJK has already done a pretty much in-depth work on that topic. And I would say that maybe just going into the former regulations that have been settled. I was thinking of, if I remember well, something that is Regulation 17, 34, and 43, and 51 that already set up a kind of path for all Indonesian banks. So that can be a good tool that can be used to for them to acknowledge and know and manage their exposure and see how they are on their sustainability report as well. So considering the small banks, I am not sure, but I wonder if it's maybe because of the concentration in the sector, maybe in calculating the risk, there will be a kind of different weighting on the small and medium bank that may be considered to be a bit more weak. That may be the point, but I would not go too far on that because I'm not specialist in it, so I wouldn't go too far.
How about you, Mr. Thomas?
So I'm trying to understand the question well enough. So there's a concentration of banks in the Indonesian banking sector, right?
Yeah.
Then how
Like
does
public
the
bank.
question relate to climate risk?
Pardon?
How does the question relate to climate risk?
The standard that could be applied for all banks in Indonesia to acknowledge the climate risk. This is the statement she stated about the capacity of banks that now concentrated in 4 biggest banks, like 4 biggest national banks, and this has implication and the ability, like different approach from the public bank sector to the private bank sector. I think that's the question too.
Yeah, so expertise is concentrated in the 4 biggest banks.
Yes.
Policy might be written for these 4 biggest banks, maybe, or maybe written for the smaller banks. And my bet would be that it would be written for the biggest ones. And that might not be such a good fit for the smaller ones. Also, they might lack the expertise, right? So you might have a buildup of risk in the smaller ones. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. But if you look at it from economic theory, it almost sounds like a type of market failure, the inability of knowledge to clear within the market. So if you think about it in terms of knowledge and expertise and clearing of knowledge and expertise, there might be a role for the regulator here to maybe stipulate that each bank needs to have a specialist and then work with this competencies framework that the OJK is developing. So you aligned with your banking license is a requirement to have the capacity not just to manage credit risk, operation risk, market risk, and liquidity risk, because if you're unable to manage that, why would you get a banking license? But also climate risk and having competency requirements for that. And that would create a market incentive, all right? And yeah, I think that. But otherwise, how to reach that, I don't really have an answer to it. I think that this calls for this sounds like a market failure, but I'm not close enough to it to positively confirm that. It kind of sounds like it.
Yeah. Okay. I hope that answered the question from Ibu Adelia Pratiwi. Now let's move on to another question from Bapak Revas Mahandika. This question is for all the speakers. As a bank, when offering green financing, it is crucial that debtors have sustainability procedures in place. However, in Indonesia, a significant number of corporations, particularly non-public companies, are currently unprepared for implementing strong ESG practices. In light of this, how can banks effectively attract companies to embrace and utilize green financing? Mr. Renik, you may answer first.
Yes, sure. It's just about engaging, getting to know the customer, talk with your customer, with an ESG expert and with the relationship manager, see where the points are, and see what is material to its business, be it, for instance, be a company which, because the main partner trade of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, maybe Europe. So we may about 10 to 15% of the export. So let's see how does it go with the latest regulation about imported deforestation. How does it go with sustainable palm oil? So all this has an impact, and this is how the regulation part may be just to get fitted into the whole, just to keep on the business going on. There is as well the awareness. Anyway, it's important. It's important through the whole organization, and it's important maybe for the bank somehow. It should be very helpful, I think, because the general public, generally in Asia, there's a poll about that, and the most part of the population is not really, I wouldn't say aware, is not much focused, I would say on ESG issues, and particularly environmental, but a bit more on the social, because the point now is just to develop, to have a nice job, to raise a nice family, and that's all. But at the end of the day, if you are this and you are living in a very polluted area, drowning in plastics and no tree around, and you have to get to some fresh air into a mall or into a forest, but it's not there anymore. So what to do? So so it's a question of awareness, and I think the banks, when they have done their own journey to their own knowledge and they accompany their customer, then there can be a great kind of pedagogy work that's to be done and to help them. So yeah, I think it's there's financial institutions are really at the heart of this whole process, and they have a huge role to play.
Yeah, Mr. Thomas, how about you? Do you see it as the challenges that banks need to give a solutions?
Well, yeah, there's a bit of a carrot and a stick, as they sometimes say, right? I think this framework, and Veronique mentioned the market with Veronique is very aligned to the framework that we covered during the presentation. That's all about client engagement. It's all about step by step unpacking with a client. Where are you? Where's your company? These are the expectations of the bank. So it's not just all like casual and really helpful if expectations are gradually communicated from at the industry level as well. So, for example, by the OJK about what banks need to do, so that there's no leverage. There's no one bank cutting corners and the other bank being very precise, and then the bank gets all the business. That used to be the case in the past, and I think increasingly that's not the case anymore. And as to the clients not having their frameworks, especially the privately owned ones, not having your frameworks in place, not having the knowledge, not having the policies, not being sighted on their supply chains. We all know the stories about smallholder farmers in palm oil, or the mills of palm oil. I think that is gonna, if you're serious about climate change mitigation, that is going to need to come, and the tools are out there. There's satellite tools tracking supply chains across the globe. So it's on the one hand, it is yes, talk to clients. On the other hand, is clarify to clients what you expect, and then it's up to the client to comply with that, because that's the term of the business.
Yeah. If the regulations there, you have to obey the regulations. If you don't follow it, and then you don't get the the loans or etc. the bank's products that you tend to have. Okay, let's move on to
but that will be a final step. So banks typically we also need to acknowledge that financing needs to flow into the economy in order to help transition the economy. You don't want to blow up an economy by saying goodbye to all the clients, right? So it's not a black or white 0 or 1 button that you can push. It's a gradual process, But you need to be clear about the direction of process. This is the total horizon. That's where we're going to move, and we expect you to come along with us.
Yeah, exactly that we should do. We should obey it. Then let's move on to I think this is the last question to all speakers. The question from Ibu Murti Dewi of Bank OCBC NESP. The question is, what are the differences between sustainability investment and sustainable funding? If the bank as a sales agent for wealth management products that based on ESG or sustainability, can it be accounted as sustainable investing? And the second question, how the bank preparing for TFCD? Is there any minimum requirement data that need to be prepared? Ms. Veronique, you may answer first, maybe?
Yes.
Or yeah,
I'm just
go ahead.
looking for the question just to make sure I'm just pinpointing it. Can you remember what time was it? Just to make sure I'm on it.
What are the differences between sustainability investment and sustainable funding? How do you see it?
So it's I would say in the bank there is the financing activity and the asset management activity, right? So if I understand well the question, it would be on how there is a balance between what's being done through the financing activity, what's being done concerning facilitated or finance emission first, going first to the loan portfolio and etc. And there is a question as well at the moment about facilitated, because maybe the investor would like to have a more clear view on what's going on with financing through market issuance that the banks have for their clients. So that is a question at the moment. So on the banking side, there will be financing activity will be finance or facilitated emissions. And on the other hand, which is the asset management part, if I'm not mistaken, that would be, we're not talking about the own reserve management of the bank. So on the asset management side, it would be on how private customers or general customers on the retail side, there are proposed green investment solutions. So I think that at the end of the day, there's a kind of balance, but I am not pretty sure about how it can be sorted out. But yet, I think on the one side, you have the contribution to less GHG emission and accompany the economy globally through the investment facilitated in green investment solution. And on the other side, we on how the organization is contributing to GHG emission through its own activity in financing, and then that's where we go into assessment and go with the customers to help them to their way, go for transition plans and help to accompany as well the brown to get green, not to get green only. So it is of the whole process. And there was another part of the question. I am not sure I can from this person.
Is there any minimum requirement data that need to be prepared for the TFCD?
Yeah, I think that anyway, the data is a big question, because of course we need, when you go there, we need a lot of data. So there should be some data, but it's all on a personal possibility and own development of each organization. I would say that risk manager would use, if they don't have the data, they would use proxy and use their own qualitative and quantitative kind of mix to assess and produce data. I would say also that there are solutions that are provided by vendors to introduce proper data and just to have a universe of data with sufficient granularity. And that's the issue. Climate risk, yes, to have sufficient granularity. But I just on the think of going to TCFD, I am not so sure. Then I would rely on Thomas' expertise. I am not so sure there is a minimum requested. It's just on the possibility of the company, of the organization, integrating all these own data, integrating the customer's data. So that's where engagement is important, and that's why upgrading the IT through the help of this. There has been recently a great study from, I think, from the unit fee about all these vendors around and what they can propose just for the bank to just get started and to assimilate all this data to be able to go up to scenario analysis and transition plans. So I don't think there is a minimum. It's always walking the talk, get started, and here we go. Maybe
All
Thomas,
right.
something more specific to add on that.
All right. Is it Thomas? How about you?
Yeah, so on TCFD implementation, like TCFD is voluntary, right? It depends on the national regulators whether the reporting on the TCFD is being made mandatory or not. Now, you see that in some jurisdictions that happens, that has happened, and in other jurisdictions it's still voluntary. So in Europe, it's more or less TCFD has been integrated into European legislation, and it's mandatory now. You see something similar happening with many jurisdictions across the globe. In terms of the types of reporting, like if the I would have to look up whether TCFD reporting is mandatory in Indonesia. I believe it's not. Of course, there's the OJK Sustainable Finance Roadmap for that runs until 2025. So I would look into that roadmap and see to what extent the reporting is integrated there or not.
All right.
Now, if it's voluntary, then TCFD is clear that there's basically 4 areas that you need to report on. So one is the governance of climate-related disclosures. So what are the governance structures within the company, within the bank, related to them? Second is the strategy with respect to climate-related exposures. So what's the approach of the company? Third is the risk management. So how are risks being managed beyond strategy? And then the fourth one is what are the metrics and the targets to make it real? Okay. It's not just stories, but what do we measure and what objectives do we set in the timeline? Okay. So even if you have like voluntary disclosure, then these would be the categories to report on.
So those are basically the framework that we need to use if we need we have to follow any kind of standardizations or TFCD kind of thing.
There's a lot of examples out there. You know, there's the TCFD knowledge hub on the website of TCFD, which provides you basically with examples of what reporting can look like or what definitions that you might want to use. And they've been working on that for many years. But high level, it's these 4 categories, and you need to report. If you report on TCFD, you need to report both on physical risk and transition risk that we mentioned earlier.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Thomas, and also Ms. Vernick for the very satisfying answer of all the questions. And please give applause to our participants that already deliver the questions. That is really, intriguing to all of the panelists and also me as a moderator. Thank you very much for our participants. And due to our limited time, we really apologize that we cannot deliver or answer all the questions. But before the session is closing, I would like to once again giving the chance to our panelists, Mr. Thomas Verhagen and also Ms. Veronique Chaplin, to deliver their closing statement. Let's start with Mr. Thomas Verhagen. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to do this out of the top of my head. I didn't write a speech in terms of closing remarks, but personally and professionally, I'm very happy that the OJK Institute is offering this type of session. And the reason I'm very happy with that is the utmost importance of Indonesia to the world. I think we all need to acknowledge, and specifically also as a Dutch person, we need to acknowledge that Indonesia has contributed much more than it received from the world in the course of history, I think. There are development issues that we need to acknowledge. They are very real and they are visible on a day-to-day basis for those of us who live in Indonesia or who have visited Indonesia. And at the same time, if we think about the size of Indonesia, the riches of Indonesia in terms of its biodiversity, its cultural diversity, its carbon store. And the potential of the people of Indonesia, which are on average very, they are very youthful and spirited if you compare it to some of the other countries in the world, including mine. I think that it is imperative for the world that Indonesia both is able to make a development that does justice to its people, and at the same time do that in a way that acknowledges and honors its inherited riches. And I think that this webinar is a contribution to that. Me speaking here is my small contribution or attempt to contribute to grow the knowledge, the awareness, and the motivation for us all to move on that path in which both the development of the people can take place, as well as the respect and the continued cherishing of inherited riches. Anyway, it's not very technical. I'm sorry for that, but I think this is the importance of us coming together here with almost 3,000 people today.
We're really, really grateful of your presence today, Mr. Thomas. Now let's move to Ms. Vernick. How about you? Please, your closing statement on this webinar.
First, I would say that it's been a pleasure to me to participating in this great webinar with this whole great question and this great point to be seen. I would say that I think it's very enthusiastic being in Indonesia, and because I think that Indonesia has a great potential and can be a great game changer. It is just at the cross of the roads, and the good path has to be chosen. And I'm sure with all the energy and all the good things OJK is putting in it, it's going to the good way. That is at the population, provided there is actually the main point to be tackled and the two usual suspects which are deforestation and industry coal production, GHG emission. So that is the point. There have been great announcements from the government to that way, and this is absolutely what is to be needed, and that's why we have to focus on renewables, be it on earth, on the sea, anywhere, circular economy, all these things. It is a necessity, because at the end of the day, it is for the people, it is for the community. It's not simply about development, it's about sustainable development and inclusive development. So we are lucky to see that there is a great wealth and possibility to be flowing to Indonesia from others, I would say supranational frameworks, and as well from foreign institutional investors that are looking at this. But what's needed is a clear path, a clear framework, and something has to be implemented. There have been many announcements, and sure, something has to be done. And as well, what Thomas said, that I would like to speak and finish my speech with the necessity of preserving the biodiversity. I would say that in Indonesia there are more than 487 remarkable biodiversity spots, and out of these only 5 are preserved. So this is something to be thought about when we think about infrastructures, projects, and development. That is an issue to be tackled, because we need some awareness a little bit there, because at the end of the day, communities need as well a good nature around them to survive and to have a good quality of life. And at the same time, I would just say that, yes, it is a great opportunity as well with the project in Kalimantan and Nusantara, because there are many plans of green developments of coal plant, and this is something that should be tackled and developed, not simply announced, but maybe going deeper into the process, and that's where the bank can do something.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vernick. We really hope so. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's Let's give applause to our panelists today, Mr. Thomas, Ms. Parnik. Thank you very much for your insightful presentations and also the discussion panel. We really sure that this discussion will be fruitful to all of the participants according to create pathways journey of the mitigating and understanding the climate risk challenges in Indonesia and also worldwide. Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas and also Ms. Parnik, for your time and insightful discussions. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we would like to inform you that OJK Institute has launched the mini site of OJK Institute that will provide access to various informations regarding the financial services sector, such as capacity building, professional certification institutions, and innovative and visionary research. For details, you may visit the www.ojk.go.id or you may scan barcode on the Zoom screen to access the mini site of OJK Institute. We have also shared a link of the feedback form in the chat feature. We'd like to kindly ask you to please fill it out before Friday, June 16th, as a requirement to get the e-certificate. You may also access today's materials through the link that have been shared by us through the chat column and OJK Institute's mini site on Friday, June 16th. The materials and recordings at the OJK Institute mini site can be opened in the capacity building menu, then choosing the How Manage Climate Related Risk in Banking Industry webinar. Then materials will appear on the page. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the 3,395 people who has registered and 2,344 people who has attended this webinar in our Zoom meetings. And our participants consist of the banking sector, 65%, the non-bank financial industry, 15%, OJK, 5%, others, 5%, academicians, 4%, government agencies, 2.5%, and the capital market sector, 1.59%. We would like to inform that the link for feedback form and materials from both speakers is available on the chat feature now. Please complete the form before the webinar is ended as a requirement to get the certificate of attendance on today's webinar. And Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to inform you that for the next week, OJK Institute will invite you again to join the webinar mengenal lebih jauh pengaturan UU P2SK dalam rangka penguatan sektor perbankan on June 22nd, 2023. We have Bapak Ida Muktianto, Direktur Manajemen Risiko dan Hukum Sekretariat Komite Stabilitas Sektor Keuangan, Bapak Anung Herlianto, Kepala Departemen Pengaturan dan Pengembangan Perbankan, Bapak Didit Widiana, Direktur Departemen Kebijakan Makro Prudensial Bank Indonesia. And we remind you again, OJK Institute is holding a call for papers activity called Charisma with the theme of 2023 being the impact of Act Number 4, 2023 regarding the development and strengthening of the financial sector on the duties and functions of supervision of the Financial Services Authority, with final deadline for writing admission on July 15, 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, and inside OJK who like to read, you can use the OJK Digital Library or e-library through the link e-library.ojk.go.id. The library provides various types of books that can be accessed by OJK internal and external. Inside OJK can directly access e-library by login using official mail and password, while for the external, you might first register your account through the register menu. Reading becomes easier anytime, anywhere through OJK e-library. All right. And also, another information coming, OJK Institute probably launched Knowledge Management System for Human Resources Financial Services sector. OJK Synthesis aims to create a collaborative and inclusive learning ecosystem for all human resources financial services sector and increase learning effectiveness with structured curriculum and in accordance with the needs of human resources financial services sector. To find out the details, you can visit link synthesis.ojk.co.id. You can also directly scan the QR code in the Zoom screen to access the OJK synthesis. Bapak Ibu, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this webinar. On behalf of Indonesia Financial Services Authority, I would like to thank you for joining today's event and We are looking forward to meet you again in the future. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Ali Hawari. Signing out. Terima kasih semuanya. Selamat sore.
Terima kasih Mas Ali,
Terima kasih Mas Adi.
Thomas. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Terima kasih banyak.